My husband bought me a smartwatch for my 33rd birthday. I brought it to work the next morning, sliding it across the sleek glass table in the break room. My coworker David, a former signals intelligence officer for the Marines, picked it up. He did not admire the rose gold casing or the expensive leather band. He turned it over, squinted at the micro serial number near the charging port, and went completely pale. He leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a dead whisper. "You need to contact the police right now. This is not a consumer device. This is a military-grade cloning bug. Whoever gave this to you is pulling a live mirror of your phone, your emails, and your ambient audio." I looked at the watch, then I looked at David. I did not flinch, and I did not scream. Instead, I reached out, took the watch from his trembling fingers, and strapped it firmly around my left wrist. "I know," I said quietly, tapping the screen to wake it up. Let him listen. I knew exactly what I was doing. As an IT data auditor, finding hidden systems was my specialty. If my husband wanted to play a digital game of chess, I was going to let him make the first move before sweeping the board. I walked away, leaving David staring after me. 3 days later, the clinking of fine crystal and the heavy scent of roasted lamb filled my mother-in-law's dining room. Patricia sat at the head of the long mahogany table, presiding over Sunday dinner like a monarch. To her right sat my husband Richard, swirling a glass of expensive Cabernet. He was the golden boy, the CEO of a tech startup that was supposedly weeks away from a Series B funding round. And then there was Naomi. Naomi, my sister-in-law, swept into the dining room late, deliberately making a show of her arrival. She is a stunning black woman who married Richard's younger brother, Greg. Naomi comes from new money and never misses an opportunity to remind everyone of it. She dropped her oversized designer bag on the floor, right next to my chair, intentionally grazing my knee with the heavy brass hardware. "Oops, sorry, Natalie," Naomi said loudly, flashing a brilliant, completely fake smile. "I did not see you sitting there in the shadows." I kept my eyes on my plate. "It is fine, Naomi." She took her seat across from me, immediately resting her chin on her hands to show off a massive diamond ring. Her eyes scanned my outfit, stopping directly on the rose gold smartwatch on my wrist. She let out a sharp, condescending laugh that echoed against the dining room walls. "Richard, you have to do better," Naomi practically purred, looking at my husband. "I know your company is about to be valued at $50 million, but you let your wife walk around wearing a cheap, off-brand fitness tracker. It completely ruins the aesthetic. Look at her. She is wearing a blazer from last season. People are going to think the startup is going under if the CEO's wife looks like a middle school math teacher." Richard let out a low chuckle, taking a slow sip of his wine. He did not defend me. He never did. "Natalie is practical, Naomi. She does not understand the value of presentation. She is just a data auditor. She likes her little spreadsheets." I cut a piece of lamb, keeping my breathing perfectly steady. The smartwatch on my wrist pulsed slightly. A tiny green light flashed. It was recording everything. Richard was sitting right there, mocking me, completely unaware that the device he bought to spy on my private conversations was currently transmitting his own arrogance straight to a secure encrypted cloud server I had set up with David. I looked up and offered Naomi a polite, cold smile. "Practicality pays the bills, Naomi. Besides, I do not need a $20,000 watch to know what time it is. But speaking of expenses, I noticed your new car parked in the driveway. A customized import. It must be nice to have that kind of disposable income, especially since Greg told us last month that his dental practice took a slight dip in revenue." Naomi's smile tightened instantly. Her posture went rigid. The diamond ring suddenly looked heavy on her hand. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat next to her, loudly clearing his throat. "We are doing just fine, Natalie." Naomi snapped, her voice losing its sugary edge. "Richard's startup is going to make sure this entire family is set for life. Once that Series B money clears, Greg is getting a board seat." "Right, Richard." Richard nodded. "Of course. Family first. My name is Natalie, 33 years old, and I recently discovered that the man I married was planning to send me to federal prison." The revelation did not come from a private investigator or a misplaced text message. It came wrapped in a velvet box on my birthday. My husband Richard bought me a limited edition smartwatch. He told me he wanted me to track my health. But when I brought it to work the next morning and handed it to my coworker David, a former signals intelligence officer for the Marines, the blood drained from his face. He examined the charging port, leaned in, and whispered that I needed to contact the FBI immediately. He said this was not a consumer device, but a military-grade cloning bug, actively transmitting my real-time location passwords and audio to a private server. I did not panic. I did not cry. I simply smiled, strapped the recording device back onto my wrist, and told David to let him listen. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever turned a toxic trap into your ultimate weapon. Trust me, you will want to hear how I dismantled my husband's empire from the inside out. 3 days later, I sat at the long mahogany dining table in my mother-in-law's sprawling suburban home. The Sunday family dinner was a mandatory weekly performance where I was expected to play the grateful, quiet wife. Richard sat at the head of the table swirling his expensive red wine. He was the golden boy, the CEO of a tech startup preparing for a massive Series B funding round. Then the heavy oak doors swung open, and my sister-in-law made her grand entrance. Naomi is a striking black woman who married Richard's younger brother, Greg. She comes from a family of wealthy developers and never misses an opportunity to remind us of her status. She dropped her oversized designer bag on the floor right next to my chair, intentionally grazing my knee with the heavy hardware. "Oh, excuse me, Natalie," Naomi said with fake sweetness. "I completely forgot you were sitting there. You always blend right into the furniture." I kept my eyes on my plate and quietly told her it was fine. Naomi took her seat directly across from me, resting her chin on her hands so the light would catch her massive diamond ring. Her gaze slowly swept over my outfit, stopping on the rose-gold smartwatch strapped to my left wrist. She let out a sharp, condescending laugh that cut through the polite dinner chatter. "Richard, you really need to do better by your wife," Naomi purred. "I know your company is about to be valued at $50 million, but you let her walk around wearing a cheap, off-brand fitness tracker. It completely ruins the aesthetic. Look at her blazer. People are going to think the tech genius CEO is going broke if his wife looks like an entry-level administrative assistant." Richard let out a low chuckle. He did not defend me. He never did. "Natalie is a practical woman," Naomi, Richard said, waving his hand dismissively. "She does not understand the value of high-level presentation. She is just an IT data auditor. She likes her little spreadsheets. You cannot force someone to have taste." I cut a small piece of roasted lamb, keeping my breathing perfectly steady. Beneath my cuff, the smartwatch pulsed with a faint green light. It was recording every single word. Richard was sitting right there, mocking my career, entirely unaware that the surveillance device he bought to destroy me was currently transmitting his arrogance straight into a secure, encrypted server I had built with David. I looked up, meeting Naomi's smug gaze with a polite, icy smile. "Practicality pays the bills, Naomi. Besides, I do not need a $20,000 watch to tell me when my time is being wasted. But speaking of expensive tastes, I noticed you drove up in a brand new imported SUV today. It must be wonderful to have that kind of disposable income, especially since Greg mentioned last month that his dental practice took a 20% dip in revenue." Naomi's smile vanished instantly. Her posture went rigid. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat next to her, his face turning a deep shade of red. "We are doing just fine, Natalie." Naomi snapped, her voice losing its sugary edge. "Richard's startup is going to ensure this entire family is set for life. Once that investor money clears, Greg is getting an executive board seat." "Right, Richard." Richard nodded confidently. "Absolutely. We take care of our own." Patricia leaned back in her high-backed dining chair, dabbing the corners of her perfectly painted mouth with a linen napkin. She had the kind of stiff silver hair that required weekly salon visits and a sharp, angular face that seemed permanently set in a judgmental frown. She looked at me as if I were a smudge on her otherwise pristine crystal glassware, her eyes full of undisguised contempt. "We do take care of our own," Patricia echoed, her tone dripping with wealthy condescension. "But Richard is absolutely right, Natalie. You simply lack the vision required for the social circles we are about to enter. Being an IT data auditor makes you nothing more than a glorified calculator. You sit in a windowless cubicle and stare at mindless spreadsheets all day. Richard is a tech visionary. He is building a legacy from the ground up. He needs a partner who understands high society, not someone who worries about saving pennies on a grocery bill or buys her clothes off a clearance rack." I placed my silver fork down on my porcelain plate, making a soft, clinking sound that drew everyone's attention. I did not raise my voice. I did not let the venomous insult pierce my composure. Instead, I gave Patricia a calm, measured look, before shifting my gaze directly back to Naomi, who was still smirking at me. "You are absolutely right, Patricia," I said smoothly, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I am just a glorified calculator. But the beautiful thing about being a calculator is that you understand exactly how numbers work. You learn how to spot glaring financial inconsistencies. For instance, you learn how to calculate the compounding monthly interest on 3 separate platinum credit cards that have been completely maxed out and hidden under a maiden name at a private P.O. box downtown." The dining room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The smug, arrogant expression was wiped completely off Naomi's face in less than a second, replaced by a pale, wide-eyed look of absolute terror. She dropped her fork and it clattered loudly against the fine china plate. Greg turned his head slowly, staring at his wife with deeply furrowed brows. "What is she talking about, Naomi?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "What hidden credit cards?" Naomi swallowed hard, her throat bobbing visibly. "Nothing," she stammered frantically, avoiding his piercing eyes. "She is just being spiteful because we called out her cheap outfit. Do not listen to her, Greg. She is just trying to start trouble because she is jealous of us." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my iced water, letting the chaos brew right in front of me. I did not need to say another word. The seed of doubt was firmly planted, and Naomi's defensive panic was all the fertilizer it needed. Greg pushed his half-eaten plate away, his appetite entirely gone, glaring at Naomi with a toxic mix of betrayal and deep suspicion. "Enough," Richard suddenly barked, slamming his heavy hand down on the mahogany table. The crystal wine glasses rattled violently. He glared at me, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched under his skin. "We are not doing this tonight, Natalie. You are not going to sit at my mother's table and try to stir up drama in my family just because you feel insecure about your own pathetic life." Richard reached down into the designer leather briefcase he had placed beside his chair. He pulled out a thick manila folder and tossed it onto the table right in front of my plate. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud. "Since we are talking about numbers and practicality," Richard said, his tone shifting into the cold, demanding voice he used to intimidate his startup employees. "My Series B funding requires a temporary bridge loan to cover operational costs for the next 30 days. It is a standard corporate procedure. The bank just needs a guarantor to secure the line of credit. I need you to sign these documents by Friday morning." I looked down at the thick folder, but did not make a move to touch it. I already knew what was hiding inside those pages. What exactly am I guaranteeing Richard? "It is just a legal formality," he dismissed quickly, waving his hand impatiently in the air. "They need a hard asset on file to push the paperwork through. We are putting up the estate your late father left you as collateral. It is perfectly safe. The investor money clears in exactly 3 weeks, and the bank lien gets wiped out immediately. You will not even notice it happened." I looked straight into the eyes of the man I had married. He was casually asking me to risk my late father's home, the only piece of my childhood I had left in this world, to fund his ego-driven startup. And he was demanding it as if it were his absolute birthright. "No," I said quietly. Richard froze completely. He blinked as if his brain could not comprehend the tiny 2-letter word. "Excuse me." I said, "No, Richard. I am not signing away my father's house. I will not be your financial guarantor. The polite, wealthy veneer of the Sunday dinner completely shattered into pieces. Richard stood up aggressively from his chair, his face flushing dark red with pure rage. He leaned far over the table, towering over me to use his physical size as a weapon. "You selfish, ungrateful woman!" he shouted, his booming voice echoing harshly through the large dining room. "I am building a massive empire for us. I put a roof over your head. I tolerate your mediocre career. You owe me this. You are my wife, and that house is marital property in the eyes of the bank. You will sign that paper, or I swear to you I will make your life a living nightmare." Patricia gasped dramatically, clutching her pearl necklace, but she did not tell her son to calm down. Instead, she glared at me fully, supporting his verbal abuse. Naomi and Greg sat completely frozen in the crossfire of the explosion. I did not shrink back from his screaming. I did not shed a single tear. I simply sat there in my chair, feeling the slight rhythmic vibration of the smartwatch on my wrist. It was recording every vicious threat, every scream, and every financial demand. The military-grade bug was capturing the exact moment my husband decided to declare full-out war on me, and he had no idea that I was more than ready to fight back. The drive home from the disastrous Sunday dinner was completely silent, mostly because I took an Uber alone. Richard had stormed out of his mother's house in a blind rage, claiming he needed to go to the office to fix the mess I had supposedly made. Now it was 2 in the morning. The house was pitch black except for the cold blue glow of the 3 monitors illuminating my home office. I sat in my ergonomic chair, the house perfectly quiet. I took the rose gold smartwatch off my wrist and placed it on a specialized diagnostic docking station I had borrowed from David. It was time to see exactly what kind of digital spiderweb my husband had woven. I typed a series of commands into my terminal, routing the connection through a secure virtual private network. As an IT data auditor, I spent my days breaking down complex financial algorithms and finding hidden backdoor access points in corporate networks. Bypassing the flimsy commercial firewall Richard had installed on the cloning bug was almost insulting to my intelligence. It took me less than 4 minutes. Lines of code cascaded across my center monitor as I traced the destination of the outgoing data packets. The watch was not just sending live audio to Richard's phone. It was mirroring everything to an offshore cloud server. The directory name was bold and unmistakable on my screen. R. Offshore Cayman. I leaned forward, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. I bypassed the server's authentication protocol and accessed the root directory. There were hundreds of audio files, text logs, and GPS tracking routes. He had been monitoring my phone and my movements for weeks before he even gave me the physical watch. I clicked on the most recent audio file, timestamped from just 1 hour ago. Richard had supposedly gone to his startup headquarters to prepare for a Monday board meeting. I put on my noise-canceling headphones and pressed play. But the background noise was not the hum of office servers. It was the soft, rhythmic clinking of ice in a glass and the sultry jazz music of a high-end hotel bar. I listened as Richard ordered a double bourbon. Then a woman's voice drifted through the audio feed. It was high-pitched, giggly, and deeply familiar. It was Vanessa, the 24-year-old public relations manager Richard had hired 6 months ago. The same woman Patricia had continuously praised at family gatherings for her youthful energy and absolute dedication to Richard's vision. "You sound stressed, baby," Vanessa purred through the audio file. "Did the dinner go bad? Did she sign the papers?" I heard Richard let out a heavy, irritated sigh. "Not yet," he muttered. "She threw a fit at the table. Tried to play the victim in front of my mother and Naomi, but she will sign it by Friday. I will make sure she does. I will threaten to freeze our joint accounts if I have to. She is too weak to actually fight back." I stared at the audio waveform moving across my screen, my face a mask of absolute calm. I adjusted the volume, catching every single syllable. "I do not understand why we even need her to sign it," Vanessa complained, her voice taking on a whiny edge. "You have the Series B money coming in. We are supposed to go to Paris next month. What if she ruins everything?" Richard laughed a cold, calculating sound that sent a chill down my spine. The Series B money is a mirage, Vanessa. The company is bleeding cash. I have been forging the revenue reports for the last 3 quarters to keep the venture capitalists interested. The bridge loan using her father's estate as collateral is the only real money left. As soon as her signature is on that bank document, the $2 million drops into our Cayman account. The room felt completely devoid of air, but I did not stop the recording. I needed to hear the rest. But what happens when the bank realizes the money is gone and the company defaults? Vanessa asked suddenly, sounding nervous. Will they not come after you? I heard the sharp sound of Richard snapping his fingers. That is the beauty of marrying a data auditor, he said smoothly. She has authorized access to our financial networks. I already planted her IP address on the transfer requests. When the money disappears and the SEC comes knocking, the digital paper trail will point directly to her. She gets charged with corporate embezzlement and federal wire fraud. I get to play the heartbroken, betrayed husband. She goes to federal prison, the bank takes her precious childhood home, and you and I start over in Europe with $2 million in untraceable cash. The audio file ended with the sound of them clinking their glasses together. I sat in the darkness of my home office, slowly taking off my headphones. He was not just cheating on me. He was actively orchestrating my total destruction. He wanted me locked in a concrete cell while he spent my inheritance. I reached down and picked up the rose gold smartwatch. It was cold against my palm. He thought I was weak. He thought I was just a glorified calculator. But calculators do not feel mercy, and I was about to zero out his entire existence. Friday morning arrived with a suffocating heaviness. Richard had spent the last 4 days acting like the perfect loving husband, completely unaware that I had listened to him plotting my federal prison sentence. He bought me flowers. He kissed my forehead before work. He played the role of the devoted tech visionary so flawlessly that had I not intercepted that audio file, I would have walked into the trap blindly. We drove downtown to the sleek glass-walled offices of First Republic Capital. Richard led me confidently by the arm, projecting the absolute image of a successful founder on the brink of a massive financial breakthrough. We were immediately escorted into a private corner office with panoramic views of the city skyline. Waiting for us was Harrison, a senior loan officer, and one of Richard's old fraternity brothers. Harrison was overly charismatic, flashing perfectly bleached teeth as he offered me sparkling water and an expensive espresso. After a few minutes of forced small talk about Richard's upcoming Series B funding, Harrison slid a massive 2-inch thick stack of legal documents across the polished mahogany desk. Just standard boilerplate stuff, Natalie Harrison said smoothly, uncapping a heavy gold fountain pen and holding it out to me. Richard's startup is going to the moon, and this bridge loan is just the temporary rocket fuel we need to get there. We just need your signature on page 714 and 32 to formally secure the collateral. Richard leaned over, tapping the desk impatiently. Come on, honey. We have a lunch reservation at that new French place at noon to celebrate. Just sign it so we can get out of here. I did not take the gold pen. Instead, I pulled the heavy stack of papers directly toward me. As an IT data auditor, I spend 60 hours a week hunting for anomalies in massive complex financial data sets. I track money laundering, corporate embezzlement, and algorithmic fraud. People lie, but numbers never do. I completely ignored the summary pages that Harrison had helpfully marked with bright yellow sticky notes. I went straight to the disbursement addendums buried in the very back of the contract. My eyes scanned the dense blocks of legal text and numerical tables in seconds. Harrison, I said quietly, my voice cutting cleanly through the forced friendly atmosphere of the room. Why does the disbursement routing schedule bypass Richard's corporate operations account entirely? Harrison's fake smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, a flash of annoyance crossing his face. It is just a standard corporate pass-through, Natalie, Richard said quickly, his voice tight. It goes to a holding company first for tax optimization. It is a high-level accounting strategy. You do not need to worry about it. I flipped to page 22, tapping my manicured fingernail against a very specific alphanumeric sequence printed in tiny font. This is an international routing number, Harrison. Specifically, it belongs to the Cayman Islands branch of a private offshore bank, and the receiving entity is listed as R Offshore Holdings, a limited liability company that was registered exactly 18 days ago. The room went dead silent. The hum of the air conditioning suddenly sounded incredibly loud. I leaned forward, making direct, unwavering eye contact with the banker. If I sign this paper, I am legally pledging my late father's estate, the house I grew up in, to secure a $2 million loan. But this document legally authorizes your bank to immediately wire that $2 million out of the country, completely bypassing the domestic accounts of Richard's startup. This is not a bridge loan to cover operational costs. This is capital flight. Harrison swallowed hard, the color completely draining from his face. He looked at Richard, a silent, terrified panic exchanging between them. Richard had obviously promised Harrison a massive under-the-table kickback to push this through, assuming I would just blindly sign the papers like an obedient, financially illiterate wife. Now, Harrison, I continued, my tone conversational but laced with absolute poison. Under the Patriot Act and current federal banking regulations, if a loan officer knowingly facilitates the transfer of domestically secured assets into an unverified offshore shell company without filing a suspicious activity report, that is a federal felony. It is considered conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The Securities and Exchange Commission will not just revoke your banking license. The federal government will seize your personal assets and put you in a concrete cell for a minimum of 10 years. Harrison visibly started sweating. A bead of moisture dripped down his temple. He reached out and frantically pulled the stack of documents away from me. Wait, let me review the routing tables again. There might have been a clerical error by our legal department, he stammered, his hands actually shaking as he gathered the papers. Richard slammed his fist on the desk, his carefully crafted CEO persona shattering into pieces. What the hell are you doing, Natalie? Are you actively trying to sabotage my company? You do not know what you are talking about. You are just a data processor. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my blazer. I am an auditor, Richard, and this transaction just failed its audit. I looked down at Harrison, who was staring at the documents as if they were a live explosive. I suggest you shred those papers, Harrison, because if this loan proceeds without my signature, I will be forwarding this entire file to the federal authorities before lunch. I turned on my heel and walked out of the glass-walled office, leaving my husband and his corrupt banker friend drowning in their own panic. The smartwatch on my wrist pulsed quietly, recording every panicked shout and curse they threw at each other as the heavy door closed behind me. The heavy glass doors of the bank lobby slid shut behind me, cutting off the sounds of Harrison frantically shuffling papers. I walked straight into the underground parking garage, my heels echoing sharply against the concrete. I did not make it to the car before I heard Richard charging up behind me. He grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging painfully into the fabric of my blazer. I stopped instantly, turning my head to look down at his hand and then up into his furious eyes. "Take your hand off me, Richard." I said the words quietly, but with enough venom that he immediately let go, stepping back as if he had been burned. We got into his luxury sedan in absolute silence. The moment the heavy doors locked, sealing us inside the soundproof leather interior, the explosion finally happened. Richard slammed both of his hands violently against the steering wheel. The car horn blared loudly, echoing through the empty parking structure. "Are you out of your mind?" he screamed, his face twisting into a mask of pure hatred. "You just threatened a senior loan officer with federal prison. You embarrassed me in front of one of my most important financial contacts. Do you have any idea what you just did to my company?" I calmly adjusted my seatbelt. "I stopped you from committing felony wire fraud." You should be thanking me. Richard whipped his head around, his eyes wide and wild. It is a tax shelter, Natalie. It is a standard corporate tax optimization strategy. Every major tech founder uses offshore holding companies to protect their assets, but you would not understand that. You do not understand how real wealth is built because you are terrified of taking a single risk in your pathetic, structured life. He threw the car into drive and sped out of the parking garage, taking the corners so fast the tires squealed against the pavement. He did not stop yelling. He spent the entire 20-minute drive trying to gaslight me into believing I was the one who was crazy. It was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. You are just jealous, Natalie. He spat, his knuckles turning white on the steering wheel. That is what this is really about. You cannot stand the fact that I am building a $50 million empire while you sit in a windowless cubicle checking other people's math. You are bitter. You want to drag me down to your miserable level because you know you will never achieve anything great on your own. I did not argue with him. I did not defend my career or point out that his empire was currently surviving on forged revenue reports and the threat of my stolen inheritance. I simply sat there and let him dig his own grave. Every vile insult, every gaslighting excuse, every admission of using the Cayman Islands account was being perfectly captured by the smartwatch he had bought me. He was practically handing the authorities a neatly wrapped confession tape. Seeing that his screaming was not breaking my composure, Richard's tone suddenly shifted. The hot, explosive rage morphed into a cold, calculating cruelty. "You think you are so smart?" he sneered, pulling the car onto the highway. "You think you can just walk into my meetings, ruin my funding, and go back to your little life without any consequences? You are forgetting who pays for the lifestyle you enjoy. You are forgetting who holds the power in this marriage." I stared straight ahead at the road. "You do not hold any power over me, Richard." He let out a dark, mocking laugh. "Are you sure about that? Because I think you are going to regret what you did today. I think you are going to learn a very hard lesson about what happens when you try to financially sabotage your own husband." Before I could ask him what he meant, my phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out. It was an automated email notification from Oakwood Premier Care, the private medical facility where my mother had been living since her stroke last year. I opened the email. The bold, automated text glared back at me from the screen. Notice of patient transfer. This email confirms that the primary financial guarantor has authorized the immediate discharge and transfer of the patient. My stomach dropped. I frantically scrolled down to read the destination. She was not being moved to another private clinic. She was being transferred to a state-run low-budget nursing facility on the edge of the city, a place notorious for severe understaffing and terrible living conditions. I turned my head slowly to look at Richard. He was smiling. It was a cold, victorious smirk. "What did you do?" I asked, my voice dead and hollow. "I called them while you were throwing your little temper tantrum in Harrison's office," Richard said smoothly, not taking his eyes off the road. "I am the secondary contact and the primary payer on her account. Since you want to be so careful with our finances, I decided we could no longer afford her luxury medical care. The state facility is much more practical. See, Natalie, I can make financial adjustments too." My hands started to shake, not from fear, but from a sudden, overwhelming surge of pure, unadulterated rage. He had crossed the line from corporate greed to absolute cruelty. He was using my sick mother as a pawn to punish me. I looked down at the smartwatch on my wrist. I was no longer just going to send my husband to prison. I was going to tear his entire life apart piece by piece. I demanded Richard pull the car over immediately. He laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound that bounced off the leather interior, but he hit the brakes at the next red light. I did not say another word. I unbuckled my seatbelt, stepped out into the busy downtown traffic, and slammed the heavy car door shut, with enough force to shake the entire vehicle. I flagged down a passing taxi and told the driver to get me to Oakwood Premier Care as fast as legally possible. During the ride, my mind raced, calculating every legal angle. Richard thought he had outsmarted me by leveraging his financial control, but he fundamentally underestimated my understanding of healthcare compliance laws. I marched through the sliding glass doors of the luxury medical facility. The lobby smelled of fresh orchids and expensive sanitation, a stark contrast to the state-run nightmare Richard was trying to banish my mother to. I completely bypassed the reception desk and walked straight down the West Wing corridor toward my mother's private suite. When I pushed open the heavy oak door, my blood ran cold. 2 orderlies were already in the room, packing my mother's personal belongings into cheap cardboard boxes. My mother was asleep, heavily sedated, completely unaware that she was being evicted. Dr. Evans, the facility's chief medical director, stood by the door holding a digital tablet. I stepped directly in front of him, physically blocking his path. "Stop right now," I commanded, my voice sharp and unwavering. Dr. Evans looked down at me with a patronizing sigh, adjusting his expensive glasses. "Natalie, I am sorry, but your husband authorized this transfer an hour ago. We have to clear the room for a new admission." I did not back down an inch. "My husband is the secondary financial contact," I stated clearly. "I am her biological daughter, and I hold her primary medical proxy. By authorizing a discharge without my explicit medical consent, you have committed a massive direct violation of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act." I pointed a finger directly at his chest. "If those orderlies move her wheelchair 1 inch past this door, I will not just sue this facility into bankruptcy. I will file an immediate injunction with the Federal Health Department and personally ensure the medical board revokes your license for gross negligence. You are looking at a minimum fine of $50,000 per violation and jail time." Dr. Evans turned completely pale. The tablet in his hand trembled. He immediately signaled the orderlies to stop packing. Just as they backed away from the bed, the sharp click of designer heels echoed down the hallway. It was Naomi. She walked into the medical suite wearing a pristine white trench coat, looking around the room with an expression of pure distaste. "Richard thought you might come here to make a scene," Naomi said, crossing her arms and offering me a condescending smirk. "He called me to come make sure the transfer goes smoothly. You are wasting your time, Natalie. Richard has full power of attorney over the finances. If he says the money is cut off, she gets moved to the county clinic. You cannot stop it." I looked at Naomi. I noticed the absolute smug satisfaction radiating from her face. She was thoroughly enjoying my pain. "You really think you are part of his inner circle, do you not?" I asked softly, stepping away from the terrified doctor and moving closer to my sister-in-law. "You think because you mock me at Sunday dinners, Richard is going to reward you and Greg with a massive piece of his tech empire?" Naomi raised her chin defensively. "Greg is getting an executive board seat next month when the Series B funding clears. We are family. Richard protects his family." I let out a dry, humorless laugh that made Naomi flinch. "Is that what he told you?" "Because according to the new corporate trust documents Richard drafted 3 weeks ago, the ones I audited on his private server, Greg has been entirely scrubbed from the equity table. He reclassified Greg's initial investment as a standard personal loan, which he legally paid back with minimal interest through a shell company." "Greg is not getting a board seat, Naomi. Richard cut your husband out completely. All those secret credit cards you maxed out expecting a multi-million-dollar payday are going to ruin you." Naomi's face completely froze. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by sheer confusion and rising panic. "You are lying," she snapped, though her voice trembled. "Am I? Call your husband right now, Naomi. Ask him to log into the corporate portal and check his equity status. Ask him why his name was quietly removed from the Series B investor prospectus." Naomi stumbled back, her hand reaching for her phone. She turned and practically ran out of the hospital room. I turned back to Dr. Evans. "Unpack those boxes," I told him coldly. "My mother's account is now fully funded by my personal trust." He nodded rapidly. I had secured my mother. Now it was time to set the final trap. I left the hospital and drove straight to my corporate office building. The glass and steel structure felt like a fortress compared to the emotional battlefield I had just walked away from. I scanned my badge at the security turnstile and took the elevator up to the 12th floor. The data auditing department was mostly empty as the evening shift had not fully settled in. David was waiting for me in the main server room, bathed in the cool blue light of the mainframe indicators. He took one look at my face and knew exactly what had happened. I did not have to explain the details about my mother or the bank. I simply walked over to the stainless steel workstation, unclasped the rose gold smartwatch from my wrist, and laid it flat on the sterile surface. "We are not just monitoring him anymore, David," I said, my voice echoing slightly over the low hum of the cooling fans. "We are going on the offensive. I need a honeypot, and I need it running right now." David nodded slowly, a fierce, determined look crossing his face. A honeypot is a cybersecurity decoy. It is a fabricated network designed to look exactly like a highly valuable, vulnerable system built specifically to lure in a hostile attacker. Once the attacker takes the bait and breaches the fake system, they think they have struck gold. In reality, they are trapped in a digital padded room where every single move they make is recorded and weaponized against them. He reached for a tangled bundle of fiber optic cables, quickly rerouting the hardware interface. David pulled up a secondary terminal and began typing rapidly. He isolated the frequency of the military-grade bug inside the watch. Instead of blocking the transmission, which would immediately alert Richard that I knew about the device, David created a localized spoof network. From Richard's perspective, the watch was still sitting on my wrist, perfectly transmitting ambient audio from my office. But in reality, the watch was now a captive audience, completely sealed off from the real world, only hearing exactly what we wanted it to hear. "We need to give him the smoking gun he is so desperately looking for," I explained, leaning against the metal console. "He wants to frame me for wire fraud so he can steal my inheritance and run off with his mistress. If he thinks I am already committing a massive financial crime on my own, he will get sloppy. He will try to use it to blackmail me into signing the bank documents immediately." David reached into his desk drawer and pulled out two high-fidelity studio microphones. He handed one to me and plugged the other into the spoofing terminal. He tapped the microphone to test the feed. "Let us give the CEO a show," he said, his voice completely deadpan. I took a deep breath, channeling every ounce of anxiety and fear I did not actually feel. I nodded to David. He hit the recording switch, feeding the live audio directly into the smartwatch's cloned network. I began to pace back and forth near the microphone, intentionally making my breathing sound erratic and panicked. "Michael," I said, choosing a random fake name for David to play along with. "I told you we need to move the funds faster. The internal audit is scheduled for next Tuesday. If the compliance board realizes I bypassed the escrow accounts, I am completely ruined." David leaned into his microphone, lowering his voice to sound like a sleazy, panicked accomplice. "I am trying, Natalie. But routing $300,000 through the dummy vendor accounts takes time. If I push the wire transfer too fast, it is going to flag the central banking system. You promised me this was foolproof." I let out a loud, theatrical sigh, rubbing my hands together near the mic to create nervous friction. It was supposed to be foolproof. But my husband is breathing down my neck about his startup finances. If he looks too closely at our joint accounts, he will see the discrepancy. "Just push the transfer to the shell company in Belize tonight. I do not care what it costs. Just get the money out of the corporate ledger before my boss flags the missing capital." David paused, adding the perfect amount of dramatic hesitation. "Fine. But this is the last time, Natalie. If we get caught, I am not taking the fall for your embezzlement." I ended the fake call by slamming my hand down on the metal desk, creating a sharp, startling noise that simulated me throwing a phone in frustration. David immediately cut the audio feed, letting the smartwatch return to transmitting the ambient, silent hum of the server room. We stood there in the quiet blue light, staring at the small rose gold device. The trap was set. Richard was sitting somewhere in the city right now, listening to his private Cayman Islands server, absolutely convinced he had just recorded his wife committing a massive corporate felony. He thought he finally had the ultimate leverage to crush me and take everything I owned. He was probably already drafting his blackmail demands. He had no idea he had just swallowed a hook lined with poison. When I pulled into our driveway later that evening, a sleek black sedan was parked right behind Richard's sports car. I recognized the specialized license plates immediately. They belonged to a senior partner at one of the most ruthless corporate law firms in the city. Richard had not wasted a single second. I unlocked the front door and walked into the grand foyer. The house was completely silent, but the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. I found Richard sitting at the large marble kitchen island. Next to him stood a tall, sharp-featured man in a custom-tailored charcoal suit. The man was casually snapping open the latches of an expensive leather briefcase. Natalie Richard said, his voice dripping with a sickly sweet, entirely manufactured sympathy. "Come sit down. We need to have a very serious conversation about your future." I kept my expression guarded slowly, walking into the kitchen and taking a seat across from them. "Who is this Richard?" "This is Donovan," Richard replied, gesturing to the man in the suit. "He is the lead outside counsel for my startup. He is also here to protect me from the massive legal liability you have suddenly become." Donovan did not offer to shake my hand. He simply reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, sliding them precisely across the marble counter toward me. I looked down at the documents, then back up at Richard, playing the role of the confused innocent wife perfectly. "What is going on? What is this?" Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter. His eyes were shining with absolute unfiltered glee. He was enjoying this far too much. "Do not play dumb with me, Natalie. I know everything. I know about the $300,000. I know about the dummy vendor accounts. I even know about the shell company you are using in Belize to hide the money you embezzled from your employer." I let my breath hitch in my throat. I widened my eyes, forcing a look of absolute paralyzing terror onto my face. How I stammered, making sure my voice trembled just enough to sound authentic. "How could you possibly know about that?" Richard let out a harsh, victorious laugh. He leaned back in his chair, looking at Donovan with a smug expression before turning back to me. "Let us just say, I have my ways of keeping tabs on my investments. And right now, you are a very bad investment, Natalie. You are a corporate criminal. If your compliance board finds out what you are doing next Tuesday, you are going to federal prison for a very long time." Donovan tapped the thick stack of papers on the counter. "That is why we are here, Natalie. Richard is offering you a way out. This is a post-nuptial agreement and a quitclaim deed. It legally severs your financial ties to Richard and his company. It also transfers your full ownership of your late father's estate directly to Richard as a form of marital penalty compensation." I stared at the documents, letting my lower lip quiver. "You want to take my house? You want to take everything? I am saving you," Richard snapped, slamming his hand on the marble. "If you sign those papers tonight and walk away with nothing, I will keep your dirty little secret. I will not report you to the authorities. I will let you try to fix the mess you made at work. But if you refuse to sign, I am calling the SEC and the FBI right now. I have absolute proof of your crimes, Natalie. Do not test me." I slumped forward in my chair, burying my face in my hands. I let out a soft, pathetic sob. They bought the performance completely. Richard thrived on the feeling of breaking me down. But while my face was hidden in my hands, I was not crying. I was calculating my next move. I slowly dragged my hands down my face, looking up at Donovan with tear-filled eyes. "I cannot just sign this right now. I need time. I need to read it. Please, Richard, just give me 24 hours. Let me process this. Let me figure out what I am going to do." While I begged, I deliberately leaned my body over the marble island, resting my left arm just inches away from Donovan's open leather briefcase. Inside the front pocket of my blazer was a small, high-powered digital proximity cloner I had grabbed from the IT security lab before leaving the office. Donovan carried a high-encryption Bluetooth key fob on a silver ring right next to the handle of his briefcase. It was the master access key used by senior partners to enter their law firm's secure servers and private elevators. My proximity cloner needed exactly 10 seconds of close contact to duplicate the rolling digital code. I kept talking, stretching my plea. You cannot just spring this on me and expect me to sign away my entire life in 5 minutes. Just give me until tomorrow night. One day, Richard. That is all I am asking. Beneath the fabric of my blazer, the cloner vibrated once against my ribs. A silent confirmation. The rolling code was successfully captured and stored. I now had full unrestricted access to Donovan's corporate law firm network. Richard sighed heavily, looking at Donovan. The lawyer gave a curt nod, signaling that 24 hours would not legally jeopardize their position. Fine, Richard said coldly, standing up from the stool. You have exactly 24 hours. We will be back tomorrow night. If those papers are not signed, I am turning you in. They packed up the briefcase and walked out the front door, leaving me alone in the kitchen. The moment I heard the heavy front door click shut, the fake tears instantly vanished from my face. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the small black cloner, tracing my thumb over the glowing green success light. Richard thought he had completely trapped me in a corner. He had no idea he had just handed me the keys to his lawyer's entire digital kingdom. The next morning, the house was suffocatingly quiet. I was sitting at the kitchen island sipping black coffee and reviewing the encrypted files I had successfully pulled from Donovan's corporate law firm servers using the cloned key fob. Richard was already at his office, completely convinced he had backed me into a corner. I was just mapping out the offshore network topology when the front doorbell rang. I closed my laptop, walked to the foyer, and checked the security camera monitor. It was Naomi. She was standing on the porch, looking nervously over her shoulder, wearing large, dark sunglasses and a beige cashmere trench coat. She looked like a terrible actress trying to play a spy. I opened the door. Naomi immediately pushed past me into the house without an invitation. She took off her sunglasses, her eyes darting around the grand foyer as if checking for hidden microphones. "Where is Richard?" she asked, keeping her voice to a dramatic whisper. "He is at the office," I replied smoothly, crossing my arms. "What do you want, Naomi?" She let out a long breath and walked straight into the kitchen, dropping her heavy designer handbag on the marble counter. She leaned against the island, suddenly dropping the hostile, arrogant persona she always wore at family dinners. Instead, she tried to look sympathetic. "I know what happened last night," Naomi said, her tone dripping with false concern. "Richard told Greg everything. He told him about the post-nuptial agreement, the embezzlement, the threat to send you to federal prison. He is planning to take your house, Natalie. He is planning to leave you with absolutely nothing." I kept my face perfectly blank. "And you came all the way over here to tell me this out of the goodness of your heart." Naomi laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "We both know I do not care about you, Natalie. But I do care about money. Greg's dental practice is practically bankrupt. We are drowning in debt, and Richard keeps stringing Greg along with promises of a board seat that never materializes. I am tired of waiting for my husband's arrogant brother to throw us a bone." She leaned closer, her eyes flashing with pure greed. "I can help you, Natalie. I know Richard is hiding money. I know about his little 24-year-old public relations manager. I have physical copies of his private bank statements from 2 years ago that he kept at our house during his office renovation. If you take those to a divorce judge, his entire post-nuptial threat falls apart. He will be forced to settle, and you get to keep your house." I stared at her, analyzing the absolute audacity of her offer. "And what exactly does this rescue mission cost?" $50,000, Naomi said without missing a beat. "Cash or a direct wire transfer to my personal account. You pay me, I give you the documents, and you get to walk away from this toxic family with your inheritance intact. Consider it an investment in your freedom." I slowly walked over to the coffee maker, buying myself a few seconds to process her sheer stupidity. She was trying to extort a woman she believed was already facing federal embezzlement charges. "I need to think about it," I said, pouring myself another cup of coffee. "I cannot just transfer $50,000 without triggering an alert. Let me check my hidden accounts." Naomi rolled her eyes in annoyance. "Well, check them quickly. I am not waiting around all day." She pulled her phone out of her pocket, tapping the screen aggressively. You have terrible cellular reception in this house. What is your internet password? I need to check an email from my interior designer. I turned around, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. It is Guest Network. The password is all lowercase welcome home. Naomi quickly typed the password into her phone. What she did not know was that the Guest Network was completely hardwired into the cybersecurity honeypot David and I had built. The moment her phone connected to the router, it passed through a hidden proxy server that immediately stripped her device's background encryption. My laptop, which was sitting closed on the counter, let out a soft single chime. I casually opened the lid. David had set up an automated data extraction script. Naomi's phone was currently syncing her local files to her cloud storage, and because she was routing through my rigged network, David was pulling a complete live copy of every single document, text message, and email she had sent in the last 30 days. Take your time, I told Naomi, watching the progress bar race across my screen. I just need to verify a few financial details. A secure message box from David popped up in the corner of my monitor. The text read, "You are not going to believe this. Look at the attached folder. She is not just a gold digger. She is a corporate spy." I clicked on the attached folder. It was filled with hundreds of pages of highly classified proprietary source code. It was the absolute core algorithmic architecture for Richard's entire startup, the exact technology he was using to court the Series B investors. I opened the most recent email thread. Naomi had been corresponding with the CEO of Horizon Dynamics, Richard's biggest and most aggressive competitor. She was not just asking for $50,000 from me. She had successfully negotiated the sale of Richard's stolen source code to his rival for $300,000, using Greg's access to the company's servers to pull the files. I looked up from the screen. Naomi was still standing in my kitchen, aggressively typing on her phone, completely oblivious to the fact that her digital life had just been violently ripped wide open. She thought she was the ultimate manipulator. But she had just handed the executioner her own head on a silver platter. I closed my laptop with a soft click. "You know what, Naomi?" I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I think we have a deal." I told Naomi I would initiate the wire transfer on Monday morning after the banks opened. She smiled, picked up her designer bag, and walked out of my house completely unaware she had just surrendered the ultimate weapon. I spent the rest of the weekend mapping out every single vulnerability in Richard's empire. The 24-hour deadline expired on Sunday evening. I was sitting in the living room when the front door slammed open. Richard strode in, but he was not alone. His mother, Patricia, followed closely behind him, clutching her expensive leather purse and wearing a look of absolute triumphant disdain. They marched into the living room like an execution squad. "Time is up, Natalie," Richard said, standing over me with his arms crossed. "Where are the signed documents?" I closed my book and placed it neatly on the coffee table. "I did not sign them, Richard. And I am not going to." Richard let out a sharp, cruel laugh. He looked at his mother, shaking his head. "I told you she would try to bluff." Patricia stepped forward, her heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. "You really are a foolish woman, Natalie. Richard is offering you a generous way out of a federal prison sentence, and you are too arrogant to take it. You never belonged in this family. You always lacked the pedigree and the intelligence to keep up with my son. Now you are going to lose everything because of your petty jealousy." Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, dropping it onto my lap. "Since you refused to sign the agreement, we are doing this the hard way. This is a formal eviction notice. I bought this house before we were legally married, and the deed is solely in my name. I want you out of my house tonight. You have exactly 15 minutes to pack your things and leave, or I am calling the police to have you escorted off my property." They stood there waiting for the explosion. They waited for the tears, the screaming, the desperate begging. Richard thrived on breaking people down, and Patricia lived for the drama of watching someone beneath her suffer. They wanted me to drop to my knees and plead for mercy. Instead, I simply stood up. I brushed the eviction notice off my lap, letting it flutter to the floor. Okay, I said quietly. Richard blinked, his smug expression faltering for a second. Okay, that is it. That is it, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion. I walked past them and headed up the stairs to the master bedroom. I did not rush. I pulled a small leather overnight bag from the closet and packed exactly 3 days' worth of clothes, my laptop, and my digital cloning equipment. I left all the expensive jewelry Richard had bought me sitting on the dresser. I did not need his blood money. When I walked back downstairs 10 minutes later, Richard and Patricia were standing in the exact same spot, looking deeply unsettled. My absolute lack of emotion was completely short-circuiting their narcissistic brains. They had prepared for a war, and I was giving them dead silence. I walked to the front door, pausing briefly to pull my house key off my keychain. I tossed it onto the entryway table. It landed with a sharp metallic clatter. "You are making the biggest mistake of your life," Richard sneered, trying to regain control of the narrative. "When I call the authorities tomorrow, you will have nowhere to hide." I looked at him, then at Patricia. "Have a wonderful evening," I said politely. I opened the door and walked out into the cool night air, leaving them completely speechless in the foyer. I ordered a private black car service from my phone. 20 minutes later, I was pulling up to the valet stand of the most exclusive luxury hotel in the downtown district. I walked up to the marble reception desk and requested their premier penthouse suite. When the concierge asked for a method of payment, I did not hand him my own debit card. I pulled out a sleek black corporate credit card. It was the physical replica of the hidden corporate card Richard used to fund his Cayman Islands shell company, which I had legally requested a duplicate of weeks ago as his corporate data auditor. The concierge swiped the card. It approved instantly. I took the golden keycard, rode the private elevator to the top floor, and walked into a suite that cost $3,000 a night. Richard thought he had thrown me out onto the street. He had no idea he was personally funding my luxury war room. Monday morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse suite. I sat in a plush silk robe, enjoying a plate of fresh fruit and a perfectly brewed espresso, paid for entirely by Richard's illegal corporate funds. I opened my encrypted laptop and initiated a secure video call with David. He answered immediately from his desk at the office, a bright smile lighting up his face. "Are we ready?" I asked, taking a slow sip of the rich coffee. David grinned widely, tapping a few keys on his mechanical keyboard. "The GPS spoofing protocol is officially live. I intercepted the location data packet your smartwatch is transmitting to Richard's offshore server. I scrubbed the coordinates of your luxury hotel and replaced them with a very specific residential address. It was child's play, honestly." "Whose address did you use?" I asked. "Vincent Cross." David replied, leaning back in his chair. "The CEO of Horizon Dynamics, your husband's absolute biggest rival in the tech sector. Right now, Richard's dashboard shows your exact location as the master bedroom of Vincent's sprawling private estate in the hills." I smiled, setting my coffee cup down on the glass table. It was a brilliant, devastating move. Richard already believed I was a corporate embezzler who had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars. Waking up to find his discarded wife supposedly hiding at his mortal enemy's mansion would completely short-circuit his narcissistic brain. He would immediately assume I was selling his proprietary financial data, or worse, his source code directly to Horizon Dynamics. While I enjoyed my luxurious breakfast, Richard was experiencing an absolute meltdown on the other side of the city. According to the audio logs David was pulling from Richard's phone, my husband had woken up, checked the tracking server to see which cheap motel I was crying in, and nearly suffered a heart attack. He tried calling Vincent Cross's office, screaming at the receptionist, demanding to know where Vincent was. The terrified assistant let it slip that Vincent was entertaining a VIP guest at the elite Oak Creek Country Club. Richard did not bother to put on a tie or button his jacket. He jumped into his sports car and broke several traffic laws, racing across town to the golf course. At 10 o'clock that morning, Vincent Cross was standing on the 18th green, gently lining up a putt. Standing next to him was Thomas Gallagher, a billionaire venture capitalist, and the primary angel investor Richard had been desperately trying to secure for his upcoming Series B funding round. It was a quiet, refined morning of high-level corporate networking. That quiet was violently shattered when Richard came sprinting across the manicured grass, his designer shirt completely drenched in sweat, his face purple with absolute rage. "Cross!" Richard bellowed, startling a flock of birds near the water hazard. Vincent paused, lowering his golf club, looking at Richard with a mixture of profound confusion and deep annoyance. "Richard, what in the world are you doing here? This is a private club. Do not play games with me, Vincent!" Richard screamed, marching right up to the rival's CEO and jabbing a finger aggressively into his chest. "I know she is at your house. I know you are trying to buy my company's internal data from my wife. It is corporate espionage, and I am going to have you federally indicted." Vincent exchanged a bewildered glance with Thomas Gallagher. Gallagher took a slow step back, clearly disturbed by the unhinged man screaming on the putting green. The club members on the adjacent holes stopped their games, staring in absolute shock at the spectacle. "I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about," Vincent said calmly, though his jaw was tight with anger. "I do not know your wife. I have not been home since yesterday morning. I strongly suggest you lower your voice and step off this green before I call security." "She is at your estate right now," Richard yelled, his voice cracking with pure panic. "She is an IT auditor. She is stealing my financial models. If you buy a single line of code from her, I will bury you both." Thomas Gallagher cleared his throat, adjusting his golf glove. He looked at Richard with absolute disgust. "Richard, is it? The CEO of the new data analytics startup." Richard suddenly realized who was standing next to his rival. His face went completely white. "Mr. Gallagher?" "Sir, I can explain. My wife is going through a severe mental breakdown, and she is trying to compromise my intellectual property." Gallagher held up a hand, silencing him immediately. "I do not care about your marital drama, Richard, but a man who cannot secure his own internal data and who storms onto a golf course screaming like a volatile lunatic is not a man I will ever trust with my capital. I will be withdrawing my firm from your Series B considerations immediately. Have a good day." Gallagher turned his back and walked toward his golf cart. Vincent Cross calmly signaled the club security guards, who were already rushing across the fairway. Richard stood completely frozen on the pristine grass, the wind knocked out of him entirely. In a span of 5 minutes, driven entirely by his own paranoia and a fake GPS signal, he had publicly humiliated himself and single-handedly destroyed his most critical financial lifeline. Back in my penthouse, I listened to the audio feed of Richard being forcefully escorted off the golf course. I took another bite of fresh fruit. The empire was crumbling, and I had not even lifted a finger. Richard did not take his public humiliation on the golf course as a sign to surrender. Instead, like a wounded animal backed into a corner, he decided to detonate his final weapon. He was bleeding capital. His primary investor had publicly abandoned him, and he still believed I was orchestrating a massive embezzlement scheme from within my company. He needed a scapegoat, and he needed it immediately. On Tuesday morning, I was sitting at my desk at the data auditing firm when a process server walked right past the receptionist and dropped a massive stack of legal documents onto my keyboard. The bold black letters across the top page were impossible to miss. It was a federal civil lawsuit and an emergency injunction filed by Richard's startup. The charges were staggering: corporate espionage, theft of intellectual property, breach of fiduciary duty, and grand larceny. He was officially accusing me of stealing his proprietary source code and attempting to sell it to Horizon Dynamics. He also included the fabricated embezzlement claims, painting me as a desperate criminal trying to flee the country with stolen assets. The subpoena demanded an emergency deposition the very next day. He wanted to drag me into a sterile conference room, break me down under oath on the official record, and force me to hand over the digital evidence he thought he had successfully trapped me with. He was demanding a complete and total surrender. Wednesday morning arrived with a torrential downpour washing the city streets in cold gray water. I wore a sharp-tailored navy blue suit and carried my silver laptop bag into the towering glass skyscraper that housed Donovan's elite corporate law firm. I was directed by a paralegal to a massive climate-controlled conference room on the 42nd floor. The walls were entirely made of glass, offering a sweeping view of the storm clouds rolling over the financial district. Richard was already sitting at the long mahogany table. He looked absolutely terrible. The confident, polished tech CEO persona had completely evaporated. Dark circles hung heavily under his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped a ceramic coffee mug. The disastrous golf course incident had clearly taken a severe physical toll on him. But when I walked in, he forced a smug, victorious smirk onto his face. He actually thought he had me backed into an inescapable corner. Donovan sat next to him, flanked by two junior legal associates and a court reporter preparing her stenograph machine. The lawyer did not waste any time with basic pleasantries. He immediately launched into a highly aggressive, condescending interrogation. For the first hour, I sat quietly and answered his rapid-fire legal questions with simple, brief statements. I played the role of the intimidated, exhausted wife perfectly. I kept my voice soft, my shoulders slumped, and my gaze lowered to the table. Donovan paced around the room aggressively, outlining the massive financial damages I had allegedly caused Richard's tech startup. He brought up my supposed presence at Vincent Cross's estate, treating the spoofed GPS data as absolute gospel. He brought up the $300,000 I had supposedly skimmed from my corporate employer, quoting the exact phrases David and I had spoken into the honeypot microphones. Natalie Donovan said, planting his hands firmly on the mahogany table and leaning directly toward me. "We have undeniable recorded proof of your financial crimes. We know exactly what you have been doing in the dark. We know you are holding stolen intellectual property. You have maliciously attempted to destroy my client's legitimate business enterprise. We have secured an expedited electronic discovery mandate from a federal circuit judge just this morning. That mandate gives us the immediate, unyielding legal right to seize and inspect your personal electronic devices to preserve crucial evidence." Richard leaned forward in his chair, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. "It is over, Natalie. Give us the laptop. If you refuse, we will have the federal marshals arrest you for contempt of court right here in this room." They thought my laptop contained the forged vendor accounts from the honeypot audio. They thought it contained the source code Naomi had actually stolen. They were absolutely convinced that cracking open my hard drive would give them the final bullet they needed to put me in federal prison. I looked at Richard. I looked at his shaking hands and his desperate, arrogant eyes. I let a long, heavy silence fill the conference room. I let my shoulders slump further down perfectly, mimicking the body language of a woman who had finally realized she was completely defeated. I reached down into my leather bag. I pulled out my silver laptop. It was the exact same device I had used to clone Donovan's key fob. It was the exact same device David had used to intercept Naomi's corporate treason. It was a digital Trojan horse packed with the most aggressive, undetectable ransomware my department had ever developed. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or object to the federal mandate. I simply looked up at Donovan, offered him a very soft, subtle smile, and slid the silver laptop smoothly across the polished mahogany table. Donovan snatched the silver laptop from the mahogany table with the eagerness of a starving animal. He did not even bother to hide his triumphant smirk as he handed it to the junior associate sitting to his right. "Extract the local drive," Donovan ordered briskly. "Pull the email archives and the financial ledgers. Let us see exactly how much of my client's money she stole." The young associate nodded, pulling a high-speed transfer cable from his briefcase and plugging it directly into the side of my laptop. He connected the other end to the law firm's primary secure terminal, built right into the conference table. Richard leaned back in his plush leather chair, crossing his arms. He looked at me with absolute contempt. You should have signed the post-nuptial agreement, Natalie. Now you get to leave here in handcuffs. I did not respond. I just watched the associate type his administrative credentials into the firm's terminal to bypass my lock screen. He was completely unaware that he had just opened the gates to Troy. It took exactly 4 seconds for the payload to deploy. The junior associate's terminal screen suddenly froze. The progress bar for the data extraction stopped dead at 2%. A sharp, loud error chime echoed through the quiet conference room. "What is wrong with it?" Donovan snapped, leaning over to look at the screen. "I do not know." The associate stammered frantically, clicking his wireless mouse. "The terminal is completely unresponsive. I am getting a critical system error." Then the absolute chaos started. The large digital display monitor mounted on the glass wall of the conference room flickered wildly. The sleek corporate logo of the law firm vanished, replaced by a solid glaring red screen. A single black padlock icon appeared in the center. At the exact same moment, the phones of every single lawyer in the room began buzzing simultaneously, with emergency alerts from the firm's IT department. Donovan pulled his phone from his pocket, his eyes widening in horror as he read the message. The stealth ransomware had not just bricked the terminal. It had used the associate's administrative credentials to jump the air gap instantly, infecting the law firm's primary cloud servers, their highly encrypted client databases, and their internal communication network. The entire firm was effectively paralyzed. Donovan threw his phone onto the table and lunged toward me, his face twisted in absolute fury. "What did you do?" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "You infected our network. This is a federal crime. This is cyber-terrorism." I remained perfectly still in my chair, smoothing the fabric of my navy blue skirt. "I did absolutely nothing, Donovan. I handed you my personal laptop exactly as you requested. You planted a virus on the drive," Richard yelled, jumping up from his seat and pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are insane. You are going to jail for the rest of your life." I slowly shook my head, my voice calm and razor-sharp. "You both might want to sit down and listen very carefully before you make this situation exponentially worse for yourselves. The electronic discovery mandate you waved in my face this morning authorized you to seize my device for the preservation of evidence. It did not authorize you to conduct an unsupervised, warrantless extraction of an encrypted drive using a third-party terminal. That requires a specific judicial search warrant, which you absolutely do not have." Donovan was breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides. "Because I handle highly sensitive corporate financial data," I continued, making direct eye contact with the furious lawyer. "My laptop is equipped with a standard legally compliant defensive failsafe. If an unauthorized terminal attempts to force a data extraction without the correct cryptographic handshake, the system assumes it is a hostile breach. It immediately deploys a defensive lockdown to protect my client's proprietary information. Your associate essentially tried to pick the lock on a bank vault, and he triggered the security die pack. You deliberately brought a rigged machine into my firm." Donovan hissed, his professional composure completely shattered. "I brought the machine you subpoenaed," I corrected him coldly. "You chose to illegally access it, and by doing so, you just poisoned your own well. Under the exclusionary rule, any data you theoretically pulled from that drive is now legally inadmissible in court as fruit of the poisonous tree. You conducted an illegal search, Donovan. Worse, your illegal search just compromised the confidential files of every single corporate client in your entire law firm. I imagine the State Bar Association is going to have a lot of questions for you." The color completely drained from Donovan's face. He looked down at this glowing red screen on the wall monitor, finally realizing the catastrophic magnitude of his mistake. He had not just lost the case against me, he had potentially ruined his entire legal career. Richard looked frantically between me and his lawyer. "Donovan, fix this," he demanded. "Make her unlock the servers. We have her dead to rights." "Shut up," Richard, Donovan snapped, rubbing his temples in utter defeat. "It is over. We have no evidence. We have no leverage. And my firm is currently bleeding millions of dollars in billable hours every single minute that network stays down." I reached across the table, picked up my silver laptop, and unplugged the transfer cable. I slipped the computer back into my bag and stood up. I suggest you call your IT department, Donovan, I said, walking toward the heavy glass doors. And Richard, I will be expecting a formal withdrawal of this ridiculous lawsuit by the end of the day. Do not ever try to intimidate me in a legal setting again. I walked out of the conference room, leaving my husband and his ruthless lawyer drowning in the absolute wreckage of their own arrogance. By Thursday morning, I received an encrypted email from the county clerk. The massive civil lawsuit Richard had filed against me was officially withdrawn with prejudice. Donovan had clearly realized that pursuing a fabricated case with illegally obtained poisoned evidence would end with him facing permanent disbarment. I sat on the velvet sofa in my penthouse, looking out over the city skyline, knowing my husband was rapidly running out of oxygen. But Richard was nothing if not a survivor. His massive Series B funding gala was scheduled for Saturday night, exactly 48 hours away. It was supposed to be his crowning achievement, a lavish event where he would formally accept $20 million from a consortium of elite venture capitalists. However, after his unhinged screaming match on the golf course with Vincent Cross, the remaining investors were deeply spooked. They needed reassurance. They needed to see stability. And in the corporate tech world, nothing projects stability quite like a smiling, devoted wife standing proudly beside the visionary founder. At noon, the heavy oak door of my penthouse suite vibrated with a series of frantic knocks. I did not need to check the peephole to know who it was. I opened the door to find Richard standing in the hallway. He looked completely exhausted. His designer suit was wrinkled, and the arrogant spark in his eyes had been replaced by a desperate, manic energy. "Can I come in?" he asked, his tone hovering somewhere between a demand and a plea. I stepped aside, letting him walk into the luxurious suite he was unknowingly paying for. He paced across the living room, running a hand through his hair, taking in the expensive decor before finally turning to face me. "We need to talk about Saturday," Richard began, forcing his voice into a calm, authoritative register. "The gala is moving forward, but the board of directors and the lead investors are nervous. The rumor mill is working overtime after that misunderstanding at the golf course. They want to see us together. They need to see a united front." I crossed my arms, leaning back against the marble entryway console. "And why would I ever do that, Richard? You kicked me out of my home. You tried to force me to sign away my inheritance. You tried to frame me for federal wire fraud. And when that failed, you tried to sue me into bankruptcy." Richard let out a frustrated sigh, stepping closer. "Because if my company goes under, you get absolutely nothing, Natalie. We are still legally married. If I secure this $20 million funding, we both win. I will drop everything. I will let you keep your house. We can quietly file for an uncontested divorce next month and go our separate ways. But I need you to put on a dress stand by my side on Saturday night and smile for the cameras. I am begging you." I looked at him, analyzing the lie. He was not planning an uncontested divorce. He was planning to secure the $20 million, hide it in his Cayman Islands shell company, and then use his renewed wealth and power to completely crush me. He needed me for one night as a prop to secure the bag. I walked over to my desk and pulled a single sheet of paper from my printer. It was a legally binding equity transfer agreement I had drafted that morning with David's help. "I will go to your gala," I said smoothly, holding the paper in my hand. "I will wear a beautiful gown. I will smile at your investors. I will play the perfect supportive wife. But I am not doing it for free, and I certainly do not trust your verbal promises." I slid the paper across the glass coffee table. "If you want me on that stage, you are going to sign this document right now. It is a formal transfer of 15% of your founder's equity directly into my name. It vests immediately. Consider it a gesture of good faith." Richard stared at the paper, then let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "You want 15% of my company? You really are greedy, Natalie." "I want collateral," I corrected him coldly. You sign this or you can explain to your investors why your wife left you right before the biggest financial milestone of your career. Richard looked down at the document. A dark, arrogant smirk slowly crept back onto his face. He thought I was being incredibly naive. In his mind, 15% of the company meant absolutely nothing if he planned to bankrupt the domestic corporation and flee with the offshore cash anyway. He believed he was outsmarting me, giving me a piece of a sinking ship just to get what he wanted for the weekend. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his heavy gold pen, and aggressively signed his name at the bottom of the page. "Fine," Richard sneered, tossing the pen onto the table. "You have your worthless equity. Now be ready by 7 on Saturday. Do not embarrass me." He turned and walked out of the penthouse, slamming the door behind him. I picked up the signed contract, perfectly validating my legal ownership of his corporate assets. He thought he was using me as a pawn to secure his fortune. He had no idea he had just handed me the legal authority to liquidate his entire existence. After the heavy oak door of my hotel suite clicked shut, I stood perfectly still for a moment, listening to Richard's rapid footsteps fade down the carpeted hallway. I looked down at the paper in my hand. His arrogant looping signature anchored the bottom of the page. I carefully folded the legally binding equity transfer agreement and locked it inside the heavy steel safe hidden in the suite's closet. Richard's signature was the final critical piece of the domestic puzzle. Now it was time to finalize the international execution. I walked over to the glass desk and opened a secure encrypted video connection on my laptop. David answered on the second ring. He looked exhausted but deeply triumphant. The pale blue glow of multiple terminal monitors illuminated his face in the darkened corporate server room. He had been running continuous extraction and compilation scripts for the last 48 hours, ensuring every single piece of data was legally pristine. I asked him for the status of the payload. David smiled, holding up a physical military-grade encrypted hard drive to his webcam. "We have it all, Natalie," he said, his voice buzzing with adrenaline over the encrypted line. "It is an absolute masterpiece of forensic accounting." I perfectly mirrored Richard's entire Cayman Islands server. I isolated every single audio recording he illegally captured using your smartwatch. But more importantly, I pulled the hidden financial ledgers. David leaned closer to his camera, his expression turning deadly serious. He did not just forge a few revenue reports to solicit those venture capitalists. He fabricated 3 entire years of corporate growth. We have the exact digital paper trail linking his offshore shell company back to his domestic startup. We even have the wire transfer receipts showing he used company funds to buy a luxury condo for his 24-year-old public relations manager. He handed us the rope and we just tied a flawless noose. The compilation is completely scrubbed of our honeypot data. It is nothing but his pure, unadulterated federal crimes. I felt a cold thrill of absolute certainty settle into my chest. "Send me the secure transfer link," I told him. David hit a key and a secure download prompt instantly appeared on my screen. I downloaded the massive, heavily encrypted file directly onto my desktop. The digital folder contained the complete destruction of Richard's entire empire, compressed into 2.4 gigabytes of undeniable evidence. As an IT data auditor handling high-level corporate compliance, I had spent years building a quiet but powerful network of federal contacts. You do not survive in my highly specialized industry without knowing exactly who to call when the numbers reveal a massive crime. I opened my secure email client and typed in the direct government address of Special Agent Jonathan Reed. He was a senior investigator at the Securities and Exchange Commission Enforcement Division in Washington, D.C. I had worked directly with Jonathan 2 years ago during a massive corporate audit that exposed a regional banking cartel. He knew my reputation. He knew I never exaggerated, and he knew I only contacted him when I had a verified, airtight case ready for immediate prosecution. I drafted a very short, highly precise message. "Jonathan." Attached is a fully decrypted forensic clone of an offshore server belonging to the CEO of a domestic tech startup. The files contain definitive time-stamped proof of ongoing felony wire fraud, heavily forged investor prospectus documents, and active international capital flight. The CEO is attempting to fraudulently secure $20 million in Series B funding this Saturday evening at a public corporate gala. I have also included evidence of illegal unauthorized wiretapping crossing state lines. I highly recommend an immediate task force review. I attached the massive digital dossier. I hovered my mouse cursor over the send button. This was the absolute point of no return. Once I clicked that button, a massive federal investigation would instantly launch. The SEC would immediately coordinate with the FBI for criminal charges. There would be no private settlements, no quiet mediations, and no corporate bailouts. Richard was going to be completely decimated by the full weight of the United States federal government. I thought about my mother lying in her hospital bed, completely unaware that Richard had maliciously tried to discard her in a state-run facility just to punish me. I thought about Patricia calling me a glorified calculator, and Naomi trying to extort me while actively selling corporate secrets to a rival. They all thought they were entirely untouchable because they had money and influence. They thought they could step on anyone they deemed financially inferior. I pressed down on the mouse. The email swooshed away, vanishing into the encrypted ether, traveling straight to the highest financial regulatory authority in the country. David watched me on the screen, reading the quiet intensity on my face. "Is it done?" he asked softly. "It is done," I replied, leaning back in my chair and looking at the city skyline. "The trap is fully armed. The SEC has the files, and they know exactly where Richard will be on Saturday night. All we have to do now is get dressed up and walk into that gala." Saturday evening arrived with the cool, crisp air typical of a Silicon Valley autumn. The grand ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel had been entirely transformed into a cathedral of corporate wealth. Valets sprinted back and forth, opening the doors of sleek black town cars and exotic sports cars. Flashing camera bulbs illuminated the red carpet, capturing the arrival of the city's most elite venture capitalists and tech magnates. This was Richard's manufactured masterpiece. He had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of stolen money just to create the illusion of absolute success. I stepped out of my hired car, planting my silver stiletto onto the pristine carpet. I did not look like a woman who had been kicked out of her home just a few days prior. I did not look like a woman facing federal embezzlement charges. I was wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue designer gown that draped perfectly across my shoulders and swept the floor with quiet, lethal elegance. My hair was pulled back into a sharp, sophisticated style, and the only jewelry I wore was a simple diamond pendant that had belonged to my grandmother. I looked completely untouchable. Richard was standing near the grand entrance, greeting a group of minor investors. He wore a custom tuxedo, trying desperately to project the image of a calm, visionary leader. When he saw me walking up the steps, his rehearsed smile faltered. He blinked, clearly thrown completely off balance. He had expected me to show up looking defeated, anxious, and subservient. He wanted a prop he could parade around to prove his domestic stability. Instead, he was looking at a woman who radiated absolute power. He quickly excused himself from his group and hurried over to me. "You look expensive," he muttered under his breath, grabbing my elbow a little too tightly. "Remember the deal, Natalie. Smile, nod, and do not say a single word about the lawsuit or the equity transfer." I smoothly pulled my arm out of his grip. "Do not touch me, Richard," I said, keeping a brilliant camera-ready smile plastered on my face. "Just point me toward the bar." As I walked into the sprawling chandelier-lit ballroom, I immediately spotted my mother-in-law Patricia and my sister-in-law Naomi. They were hovering near a massive ice sculpture, clutching their champagne flutes. When they saw me, their faces simultaneously dropped into identical expressions of pure, unadulterated shock. Patricia's mouth actually fell open. She had personally watched me pack a single overnight bag and leave the house empty-handed. She could not comprehend how I was standing in the VIP section of the gala looking like a billionaire. Naomi, however, did not just look shocked. She looked entirely consumed by jealous rage. She was wearing a flashy, overly sequined dress that suddenly looked cheap under the warm, sophisticated lighting of the ballroom. She glared at my gown, clearly doing the mental math on exactly how much it cost. I offered them both a polite, dismissive nod and walked over to the corner of the room to grab a glass of sparkling water. I stood near a towering floral arrangement, quietly observing the room. That is when I saw Naomi marching toward me. She had traded her champagne flute for a large, brimming glass of dark red wine. Her eyes were fixed squarely on the bodice of my midnight blue gown. The tactic was painfully obvious. It was a classic, pathetic high school maneuver. She was going to accidentally douse me in red wine and force me to leave the gala in utter humiliation before the major investors even had a chance to meet me. I kept my eyes on her reflection in the mirrored wall panel next to me. Naomi sped up her pace as she closed the distance, her high heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "Oh, Natalie!" Naomi called out in a falsely sweet voice, lifting the heavy glass of red wine as she prepared to fake a stumble. I did not panic. I waited until she was exactly 2 feet away, already leaning her weight forward, to execute the spill. At the precise fraction of a second that the dark red liquid launched out of the crystal glass, I took a single fluid step to my right. I dodged it completely. Naomi gasped, losing her actual balance, as her momentum carried her forward. The entire glass of red wine flew past me and splashed directly onto the woman who had been standing right behind me. A loud, horrified shriek echoed through the VIP section. The woman standing behind me was Cynthia Grant. She was the wife of Maxwell Grant, the single most powerful billionaire angel investor left on Richard's prospect list. Cynthia was wearing a pristine custom white silk gown, or at least she had been. Now the entire front of her dress was soaked in a massive dripping stain of dark crimson. The music in the ballroom seemed to grind to a halt. Every single head in the VIP section turned to look at the disaster. Naomi stood frozen in sheer terror, holding her empty glass. Cynthia Grant looked down at her ruined silk gown, her face turning a bright, furious red. She slowly looked up and locked eyes with Naomi. "What is wrong with you?" Cynthia screamed, her voice cutting through the silent room like a knife. Richard pushed his way through the crowd, his face draining of all color when he saw what had happened. He looked at Naomi, then at the furious billionaire's wife, realizing instantly that his sister-in-law had just physically assaulted the wife of the man holding the $20 million check. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, watching the absolute chaos unfold. The gala had not even officially started and the empire was already burning. Richard was practically hyperventilating. He hovered around Cynthia and Maxwell Grant, offering a rapid stream of desperate, pathetic apologies. Cynthia did not even acknowledge him. She furiously dabbed at the massive red wine stain ruining her custom white silk gown, glaring absolute daggers at Naomi. Maxwell Grant, the billionaire angel investor holding the financial fate of Richard's entire company in his hands, looked at my husband with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He placed a firm, protective hand on his wife's back and escorted her straight out of the ballroom toward the private elevators. He left Richard standing in the center of the VIP section, looking like a man who had just watched his house burn to the very ground. A few feet away, Greg grabbed Naomi by the upper arm. His face was a mask of furious humiliation. He physically dragged her toward the coat check, ignoring her frantic protests. The great untouchable family alliance was completely imploding before the first course of the evening was even served. I remained standing near the towering floral arrangement, slowly sipping my sparkling water. I was a serene island of calm in the middle of a corporate disaster. "Excuse me, Mrs. Natalie." The voice was soft, attempting to sound highly professional, but I recognized the underlying high-pitched, breathy cadence instantly. I had listened to that exact voice on my encrypted laptop, giggling with my husband in a dark hotel bar while actively plotting my federal prison sentence. I turned around slowly. Standing before me was a young woman no older than 24. She was wearing a sleek black dress and a discreet wireless earpiece, trying to blend in with the hotel staff. but I noticed the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. The exact bracelet Richard had charged to his hidden corporate card last month. She was holding a silver clipboard tightly against her chest. She looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes, completely unaware that I knew exactly who she was. This was Vanessa, Richard's public relations manager, his mistress, the woman he was planning to flee to Europe with after draining the company accounts. "Good evening," she said, offering a practiced, highly convincing smile. "I am one of the lead event coordinators for the gala tonight. Richard asked me to bring you this updated itinerary." She held out a piece of thick embossed cardstock. I took it, my eyes scanning the beautifully printed timeline. According to this new schedule, I was supposed to be escorted to a private soundproof green room on the second floor immediately. I was scheduled to remain there for the next 2 hours, completely missing the main keynote presentation and the crucial investor networking session. "Richard wants it to be a surprise," Vanessa explained, leaning in slightly as if sharing a highly classified corporate secret. "He is planning a massive romantic dedication to you at the very end of the night. He wants you safely tucked away in the VIP lounge so the professional photographers can capture your grand entrance when he calls you to the stage. I can have security escort you up there right now." It was a remarkably clumsy trap. Richard was terrified of what I might say to his remaining investors. He wanted me locked in a room out of sight and completely neutralized while he stood on stage and lied about his company's financial health to secure the $20 million. And he had sent his mistress to personally deliver the bait. I looked down at the schedule, then slowly looked back up at the young woman. I did not drop my polite, camera-ready smile. "Thank you so much," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly measured. "But you are not an event coordinator, are you?" The practiced smile on her face twitched violently. She blinked, her grip tightening slightly on the edges of her silver clipboard. "I am sorry, I do not understand what you mean." I took a half-step closer to her, invading her personal space. I elevated the volume of my voice just enough so that it carried clearly over the ambient string quartet playing in the background. The surrounding executives and their wealthy wives paused their conversations, their attention magnetically drawn to the sudden sharp shift in my tone. I said, "Thank you, Vanessa," I announced clearly. "I really appreciate the public relations manager of my husband's startup taking the time to hand-deliver my fake schedule. It is truly above and beyond your standard job description." Vanessa's face went completely rigid. The color began to drain rapidly from her cheeks. She darted a panicked look around the crowded room, realizing that several highly important guests were now staring directly at her. "I do not know what you are talking about," she whispered frantically, taking a quick, unstable step backward in her heels. I did not let her retreat. I projected my voice even louder, delivering the absolute final blow with surgical precision. "While I have you here, Vanessa, I just wanted to ask about the monthly maintenance fees on that beautiful new luxury condo Richard bought you downtown. Are you paying those out of your standard domestic salary, or are you still illegally pulling direct wire transfers from the R Offshore Holdings account at the Cayman Islands First National Branch? Because the federal regulators are going to find those exact routing numbers very interesting when they review your bank statements next week." The heavy silver clipboard slipped from Vanessa's trembling fingers. It hit the polished marble floor with a loud, echoing crash that silenced the entire immediate area. Vanessa was not a hardened criminal mastermind. She was a naive 24-year-old who thought she was playing a fun, lucrative game of corporate espionage with a wealthy CEO. But hearing the exact name of the secret offshore account, the account she knew contained millions of dollars of stolen investor money, completely shattered her reality. She knew exactly what it meant. She was a documented accessory to federal wire fraud. She did not say a single word. She let out a sharp, terrified gasp, turned on her heel, and literally sprinted toward the kitchen service doors. She pushed through the swinging double doors, abandoning Richard and his sinking ship without a second thought. I stepped gracefully over the fallen clipboard, took one last sip of my sparkling water, and set the glass down on a passing waiter's tray. It was time to take my seat. The main presentation was about to begin. The lights in the grand ballroom dimmed, signaling the start of the evening's main event. I found my assigned seat at one of the VIP tables right at the front of the stage. Patricia was seated 2 chairs away, her face tight with suppressed fury, while Naomi was nowhere to be seen, likely still hiding in the coat check area with Greg. The atmosphere in the room was exceptionally tense. The dramatic departure of Maxwell Grant had sent a harsh ripple of anxiety through the remaining venture capitalists. Richard needed to deliver the performance of his lifetime to salvage his fragile Series B funding. A hush fell over the crowd as the Master of Ceremonies introduced the visionary founder and CEO. Richard walked onto the brightly lit stage to a round of polite, hesitant applause. He had managed to wipe the sheer panic from his face, replacing it with the polished, charismatic mask he had spent years perfecting. He stood behind the sleek acrylic podium, looking out over the sea of billionaires, industry titans, and hedge fund managers. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Richard began, his voice projecting smoothly through the state-of-the-art sound system. "We are standing on the precipice of a technological revolution. Over the past 3 quarters, our data analytics platform has not just met expectations, we have entirely shattered them." I sat perfectly still, watching my husband construct a magnificent castle out of absolute lies. Richard clicked his remote, and a massive LED screen behind him lit up with towering bar graphs and skyrocketing revenue projections. Our user acquisition costs have dropped to industry lows, while our enterprise contracts have generated over $12 million in sustained annual recurring revenue. He lied, without a single flinch. These metrics are the reason we are currently valued at $50 million. But we are not stopping there. With your partnership in this Series B round, we are going to scale this technology globally. He was incredibly convincing. If I had not personally audited his actual disastrous financial ledgers, and if I had not spent hours listening to him confess his frauds on his private offshore server, I might have believed him myself. He was selling a ghost ship, hoping to collect the cash before the investors realized there was no hull. Then Richard made his absolute most fatal mistake. He decided to play the family man card. But building an empire is never a solo endeavor. Richard continued, his voice softening into a tone of manufactured vulnerability. It requires a solid, unshakable foundation. It requires unwavering support. I would not be standing on this stage today reaching these incredible financial milestones without the brilliant, beautiful woman sitting right in the front row. My wife, Natalie. A bright spotlight suddenly swung across the room, illuminating my table. The faces of dozens of wealthy investors turned to look at me, expecting a demure wave. Richard extended his hand toward me from the stage, inviting me up. He thought he was trapping me under the public spotlight, forcing me to play the obedient, supportive wife in front of his crucial audience to secure his final checks. I did not break my polite, radiant smile. I stood up gracefully, smoothing the heavy silk skirt of my midnight blue gown. A smattering of warm applause broke out across the ballroom as I walked toward the stage stairs. Patricia watched me with a smug, satisfied expression, clearly thinking I had finally submitted to my proper place as Richard's accessory. I climbed the short flight of stairs and walked across the brightly lit stage. Richard took a step away from the podium, moving to wrap his arm around my waist for the press cameras. He leaned in close, keeping his fake smile plastered on his face while whispering sharply through his teeth. "Good girl," he muttered, so only I could hear. "Just wave and let me finish the pitch." I did not let him touch me. I smoothly sidestepped his embrace, leaving his arm awkwardly suspended in the air. Instead of standing passively by his side, I stepped directly behind the acrylic podium, taking total command of the stage. The massive crowd of investors murmured in confusion, shifting in their seats. Richard's smile completely vanished. He took a frantic step toward me. "Natalie, what are you doing?" he hissed, real panic finally bleeding back into his voice. "Get away from the console." I ignored him entirely. I looked out at the audience, offering them a warm, highly confident smile. Then I unclasped the rose gold smartwatch from my left wrist. The modern podium was equipped with a master audio-visual control deck featuring a direct universal serial bus input used by presenters to load emergency media. It was hardwired directly into the ballroom's primary projection and amplification system. I did not need a laptop. David had pre-programmed the military-grade cloning bug to bypass all security protocols and act as an aggressive mass storage drive the moment it detected a hardwired connection. I looked at Richard, who was now staring at my hand in absolute paralyzing horror, finally recognizing the exact watch he had weaponized against me. I plugged the smartwatch directly into the main AV console. The moment the metal connector of the smartwatch slid into the universal serial bus port, the entire audiovisual system of the Four Seasons Grand Ballroom experienced a forced reboot. The towering bar graphs and skyrocketing revenue projections that Richard had just bragged about abruptly vanished from the massive LED screens behind us. They were replaced by a stark, solid black background. A heavy, absolute silence fell over the room as the ambient string quartet music was instantly overridden by the system override. Then my husband's voice echoed through the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers. It was not the polished, charismatic voice of the visionary CEO he had just used to address the crowd. It was the cruel, calculating tone I had listened to in my dark home office days ago. The audio was crystal clear, amplified to reach every single corner of the sprawling ballroom. "The Series B money is a mirage, Vanessa." The sound of Richard's voice speaking his mistress's name sliced through the air. A collective gasp rippled through the front row of VIP tables. Investors who had been leaning back in their chairs suddenly sat bolt upright. "The company is bleeding cash." Richard's recorded voice continued completely unfiltered and echoing over the heads of the billionaires he was actively trying to defraud. "I have been forging the revenue reports for the last 3 quarters to keep the venture capitalists interested. The bridge loan using her father's estate as collateral is the only real money left. As soon as her signature is on that bank document, the $2 million drops into our Cayman account." The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and violently chaotic. The polite, refined atmosphere of the corporate gala completely shattered. Dozens of high-level executives began shouting over each other. Cell phones were yanked out of tuxedo pockets as hedge fund managers frantically began texting their legal teams to halt any pending wire transfers to Richard's firm. One prominent venture capitalist actually stood up and threw Richard's beautifully printed financial prospectus directly onto the floor in utter disgust. Richard physically recoiled as if he had been struck by a high-voltage wire. His face turned a sickly ashen gray. He lunged across the stage toward the acrylic podium, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished floor. His hands grasped desperately at the AV console. "Turn it off!" he screamed, his voice completely raw with panic. He grabbed the rose-gold smartwatch and ripped it out of the port. But the audio did not stop. David had not just designed a simple playback drive. The moment the watch connected, an automated script had instantly dumped the audio files directly into the hotel's internal amplification cache and initiated a localized administrative lockdown. Pulling the physical watch out did absolutely nothing. What happens when the bank realizes the money is gone and the company defaults? Vanessa's high-pitched, whiny voice rang out through the speakers, filling the room with the sound of their offshore conspiracy. "Will they not come after you?" I stepped back from the podium, watching Richard frantically slam his fists against the touchscreen interface. He was desperately swiping and tapping, trying to find a kill switch, but the console screen was completely frozen, displaying only a single glowing red padlock icon. That is the beauty of marrying a data auditor. Richard's recorded voice laughed a cold, arrogant sound that made several investors in the front row curse out loud. "When the money disappears and the SEC comes knocking, the digital paper trail will point directly to her. I get to play the heartbroken, betrayed husband. She goes to federal prison, the bank takes her precious childhood home, and you and I start over in Europe with $2 million in untraceable cash." "Stop listening to this!" a shrill, hysterical voice shrieked from the floor. It was Patricia. My mother-in-law had jumped up from her assigned seat, her face twisted into a mask of pure desperation. She ran toward the edge of the stage, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at me. "She is a hacker," Patricia screamed at the crowd of outraged billionaires. "Do not listen to a word of this. She is a jealous, bitter woman. My son is a genius. She used artificial intelligence to fake his voice because she wants to destroy his legacy. She is a liar and a criminal. Security, get her off this stage right now. Arrest her for corporate sabotage. My son built this company from nothing, and you are all letting this vindictive calculator ruin him." The investors ignored Patricia completely. They were not fools. They were some of the most ruthless financial minds in Silicon Valley. They knew the difference between a cheap digital fake and raw ambient surveillance audio. They could hear the clinking of ice in the glasses, the background noise of the hotel bar, and the subtle, unmistakable inflections of Richard's arrogance. It was undeniably real. Richard finally realized he could not stop the audio. He slowly turned away from the locked console and looked at me. The sheer, unadulterated terror in his eyes was the most satisfying thing I had ever witnessed. "You ruined me," he whispered, his voice trembling so badly I could barely hear him over the sound of his own recorded confession playing on a loop. "I did not ruin you, Richard," I replied, my voice calm and perfectly steady. "You built a house of cards. I just opened a window. But I was not finished yet." The trap had multiple layers, and it was time for the second explosive to detonate. Before the crowd could fully process my response to Richard, the sharp sound of heavy footsteps pounded up the wooden stage stairs. It was Naomi. She had apparently abandoned her hiding spot by the coat check when she realized the $20 million investor pool was evaporating before her eyes. She stormed across the stage, her flashy, sequined dress catching the harsh glare of the spotlights. Her face was twisted into an ugly mask of sheer desperation. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "You are a psychotic, jealous woman," Naomi shrieked, her voice echoing through the open microphones. "Do not listen to her." She fabricated all of these audio files because Richard was finally going to divorce her. She is just a bitter, pathetic nobody trying to steal his moment. She is completely insane. I turned away from Richard and looked at my sister-in-law. She was breathing heavily, trying to stand shoulder to shoulder with Richard as a unified front of family loyalty. She honestly believed that by defending him right now, she could salvage the Series B funding and secure Greg's promised executive board seat. She was still blinded by her absolute greed. "Loyalty is a beautiful concept, Naomi," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "But it is incredibly fragile when there is a price tag attached to it." I reached over to the smartwatch still plugged into the main AV console. I tapped the glass face twice. David had configured the secondary payload to trigger on a double-tap command. The audio of Richard and Vanessa instantly stopped. The massive LED screens behind us flickered, transitioning from pitch black to blindingly bright white. High-resolution screenshots of text messages, encrypted emails, and wire transfer receipts filled the towering digital displays. The entire ballroom collectively gasped for the second time that night. Right there, projected at 20 feet tall for every billionaire and venture capitalist to see, was a direct text message thread between Naomi and Vincent Cross, the CEO of Horizon Dynamics. I stepped back, allowing Naomi to get a perfect view of her own digital execution. "These are timestamped text messages from earlier this week," I announced to the silent captive audience. While Richard was busy lying to all of you about his financial health, his loyal sister-in-law was busy selling his core algorithmic architecture to his absolute biggest market competitor. Naomi staggered backward as if she had been physically shoved. Her jaw dropped open. She stared at the massive screen, reading her own words displayed in glowing text. "I need $100,000 wired to my personal offshore account today," as a good faith deposit. The text message on the screen read plainly, identifying Naomi's phone number. "Once the transfer clears, I will use Greg's administrative credentials to pull the rest of the source code. You get the technology, Richard goes bankrupt, and I get paid." Beneath the text message was a verified banking receipt showing a completed wire transfer of exactly $100,000 from Horizon Dynamics directly into Naomi's hidden account. Richard spun around, staring at the screen. The betrayal hit him like a freight train. He looked at Naomi, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and absolute fury. "You sold my source code!" he screamed, lunging toward her. "You stole my data and sold it to Vincent!" Naomi threw her hands up defensively, backing away from him. "It is not what it looks like, Richard," she stammered, her voice high and breathless with panic. "I can explain. She hacked my phone. She fabricated these messages too." "Stop lying!" A booming, furious voice roared from the floor. It was Greg. Richard's brother stood near the front row of VIP tables. His face was a dark, dangerous shade of purple. He was staring at the screens, completely ignoring Richard and the investors. His eyes were locked on the part of the text message where Naomi explicitly stated she was using his administrative credentials to commit corporate espionage. Greg marched right up to the edge of the stage. "You used my security clearance to steal the code," Greg yelled, his voice shaking with absolute rage. "You committed a federal crime and attached my name to it. You put me in the crosshairs of a corporate felony just so you could steal $100,000 and hide it in a private account." Naomi rushed to the edge of the stage, crouching down to look at her husband. "Greg, please," she begged, tears finally streaming down her face. "I did it for us. We were drowning in debt. Richard was never going to give you that board seat. I was just trying to protect our family." "You did not do this for our family," Greg spat, pointing a finger aggressively at her. "You did this for yourself. You have always only cared about yourself. We are done, Naomi. Do you hear me? Do not come back to our house tonight. Do not call my phone. I am calling my lawyer first thing Monday morning, and I am filing for divorce. I will not go to federal prison because of your greed." Greg turned his back on her and stormed out of the ballroom without looking back. Naomi collapsed onto her knees right there on the stage, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The flashy, arrogant woman who had mocked my cheap clothes and maxed out her secret credit cards was now completely broken. I looked at Patricia, who was now sitting rigidly in her chair, her face pale and her mouth clamped shut. The golden family she had so proudly weaponized against me had just completely cannibalized itself in under 5 minutes. But the most important guests were yet to arrive. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung shut behind Greg, sealing Naomi's fate. She remained on the floor of the stage, her expensive sequined dress pooling around her as she wept loudly into her hands. But Richard did not kneel to comfort his sister-in-law. He did not offer her a single word of support. Instead, he completely ignored her, stepping right over her trembling form to march directly toward me. He had lost his brother. He had lost his top-tier angel investors. He had lost his public relations mistress. But his towering narcissism would not allow him to accept total defeat. He stopped 3 feet away from me, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a desperate manic fire. He looked out at the remaining venture capitalists who were still standing by their tables in shocked silence. "Do not listen to another word she says," Richard shouted, his voice cracking but loud enough to command the room. "She is a corporate terrorist. Every single piece of audio you just heard is completely inadmissible in a court of law. It is entirely worthless." He turned his furious gaze back to me, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. He had clearly spent enough time with his lawyer, Donovan, to pick up a few legal buzzwords, and he was now wielding them like a blunt weapon. "You illegally wiretapped me, Natalie." Richard sneered, a twisted, arrogant smile fighting its way back onto his pale face. "You planted a recording device on me without my knowledge. Under federal law and state, 2-party consent statutes, recording a confidential conversation without the explicit permission of everyone involved is a felony. That means every single audio file you just played is classified as fruit of the poisonous tree. A judge will throw it out immediately. You cannot use it to prove fraud. You cannot give it to the authorities. You have absolutely no legal evidence against me. But I have a rock-solid criminal case against you for felony wiretapping. You are going to federal prison, and I am going to make sure you stay there." Patricia, who had been sitting frozen in her chair, suddenly let out a loud, triumphant gasp. She stood up, clapping her hands together. "That is right," she yelled to the crowd of investors. "Arrest her! She broke the law." I stood behind the glowing AV console, perfectly composed, letting his desperate legal threats echo through the silent ballroom. I looked at Richard's smug face. He honestly believed he had found the ultimate loophole. He thought his basic understanding of privacy laws was going to save his crumbling empire. I leaned into the microphone. "You are absolutely right about the law, Richard." I said, my voice smooth and chillingly calm. "Federal courts are incredibly strict about unauthorized surveillance. An illegally placed wiretap is completely inadmissible, but you are entirely wrong about who broke the law." Richard frowned, his smug smile faltering slightly. "What are you talking about?" I raised my left arm, pointing to the empty space on my wrist where the device used to be, before gesturing down to the AV console where it was currently plugged in. "I did not plant a recording device on you, Richard," I explained, speaking slowly and clearly, so every single billionaire in the room could hear the absolute finality of his destruction. "I did not purchase a surveillance bug. I did not illegally infiltrate your private communications." I tapped the glass screen of the smartwatch. "You bought this watch, Richard. I pulled the purchase order from your corporate accounts. You paid for it using the company credit card. More importantly, you personally registered the device's serial number and its hidden listening software under your own name and your own administrative credentials. You actively configured it to transmit audio to your own private Cayman Islands server." Richard stopped breathing. The color completely vanished from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost standing under the bright stage lights. "When you gave this watch to me as a birthday gift," I continued, my voice cutting through the dead silence of the ballroom, "like a scalpel, you legally gifted me a company-issued wearable device. And as a senior data auditor, I simply took my company-issued device and synced its data output to the public board accessible corporate cloud. I did not wiretap you, Richard. You bought a microphone, turned it on, registered it to yourself, and then proceeded to loudly confess to felony wire fraud and capital flight while sitting right next to your own active recording device." The remaining investors stared at Richard in absolute disbelief. He had not been framed. He had literally recorded his own financial crimes and handed the evidence directly to his wife. I leaned forward, delivering the ultimate devastating conclusion. "You wiretapped yourself, Richard. You authorized the recording. You own the server. That means there is absolutely no violation of two-party consent. Every single second of that audio is perfectly legal, entirely admissible, and currently sitting in the inbox of the Securities and Exchange Commission." Richard stumbled backward, his legs suddenly giving out. He hit the acrylic podium, gripping the edges just to keep himself from collapsing to the floor next to Naomi. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He was completely trapped in a cage of his own design. And right on cue, the heavy, unmistakable sound of approaching sirens began to wail in the distance, cutting through the cool night air outside the hotel. The final guests had arrived. The wailing of the sirens grew deafening, bouncing off the glass and steel architecture of the Four Seasons exterior. Inside the ballroom, the remaining investors froze in their tracks. The heavy gold-plated doors at the back of the room did not just open, they were violently thrust apart. A dozen men and women poured into the lavish space. They were not wearing designer tuxedos or silk evening gowns. Half of them wore dark navy windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI emblazoned across their backs. The other half wore sharp, nondescript gray suits clutching leather briefcases and federal warrants. "Federal agents," a tall man at the front of the formation shouted, holding up a golden badge that caught the light of the crystal chandeliers. "Nobody leave this room. Secure all the exits immediately." The reaction from the Silicon Valley elite was instantaneous and utterly chaotic. These were men and women who controlled billions of dollars, people who usually dictated the terms of every room they entered. But in the face of a massive federal raid, They scrambled like frightened animals. Chairs were knocked over. Champagne glasses shattered against the polished marble floor. Venture capitalists practically tripped over each other, backing away from the stage as fast as they physically could. They were terrified of being caught in the blast radius of Richard's massive corporate fraud. No one wanted to be photographed standing anywhere near the man. The lead FBI agent marched straight down the center aisle, his eyes locked firmly on the stage. He was flanked by 3 other armed agents. Right beside him walked a man I recognized instantly, Special Agent Jonathan Reed from the Securities and Exchange Commission. He gave me a brief, sharp nod as he approached the stage. Richard was still leaning heavily against the acrylic podium, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He looked at the approaching federal agents with wide, unblinking eyes. The reality of his situation had finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his towering ego. He had nowhere to run, and nobody left to manipulate. Richard, the lead FBI agent, barked, stepping onto the stage and pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and multiple violations of the Securities Exchange Act." Richard shook his head frantically, holding up his trembling hands. "Wait, please wait, this is a massive misunderstanding," he pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "I am the CEO. I have investors. You cannot just come in here and do this to me. My lawyer is on his way." The federal agents did not care about his corporate title, and they certainly did not care about his excuses. 2 agents grabbed Richard by the shoulders, spinning him around with brutal, practiced efficiency. They slammed him chest first against the clear acrylic podium, the very same podium where he had stood just 15 minutes earlier, arrogantly lying to a room full of billionaires to steal their money. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent recited loudly, aggressively pulling Richard's arms behind his back. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the silent ballroom was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. No, a piercing, hysterical shriek tore through the room. Patricia pushed her way past a group of terrified hedge fund managers. She was pulling at her own perfectly styled silver hair, her face completely flushed with absolute panic. She reached the edge of the stage, watching in utter horror as the federal agents patted her son down and confiscated his phone. "You cannot take him," Patricia screamed, her voice bordering on entirely unhinged. "He is a tech genius. He is a good boy. It is her fault. Arrest her. She set him up with fake audio files. She is a criminal." An SEC regulator stepped directly into Patricia's path, holding up a firm hand to block her from rushing the stage. "Ma'am, you need to step back immediately, or you will be detained for interfering with a federal arrest," he ordered coldly. Patricia looked from the stern, unyielding face of the federal regulator to her golden child son, who was now fully restrained and sobbing openly like a child. The illusion of her perfect superior family completely shattered in her mind. The crushing weight of public humiliation finally broke her. Her eyes rolled back into her head. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed in a dead faint, hitting the carpeted floor with a heavy thud. Not a single person rushed to help her. The wealthy investors just stared down at her unconscious body with sheer disgust, stepping further away. Jonathan Reed climbed the stairs to the stage and walked over to me. He looked at the locked AV console, then at the massive LED screen still displaying the damning text messages. He carefully unplugged the rose gold smartwatch and dropped it into a secure plastic evidence bag. "You always deliver a flawless data package," Natalie Jonathan said quietly, offering a rare, genuine smile. "We hit the Cayman Islands server exactly 10 minutes ago. The international authorities have already frozen the offshore accounts. He is not getting a single dime out of this country." I looked down at Richard. 2 FBI agents were marching him toward the service elevator. He dragged his feet completely broken, his expensive tuxedo wrinkled and ruined. He did not look like a visionary founder anymore. He looked exactly like a pathetic, arrogant criminal who had finally run out of lies. "Thank you, Jonathan," I replied smoothly. smoothing the skirt of my midnight blue gown. But we are not quite finished here. I still have a company to liquidate. I walked slowly across the ballroom floor, my heels stepping carefully around the shattered champagne glasses and abandoned marketing brochures. Paramedics had already arrived to load Patricia onto a stretcher. She was completely unresponsive, her perfectly styled silver hair now a tangled mess as they wheeled her out the side exit. I did not stop to check on her. I followed the path the federal agents had taken, moving toward the bank of service elevators at the end of the long marble hallway. The FBI agents had paused to wait for the secure transport car. Richard was pinned between them, his hands tightly cuffed behind his back, his head hanging low. When he heard the sharp click of my stilettos approaching, he lifted his head. The sight of me standing there, perfectly composed and untouched in my midnight blue gown, ignited one final desperate spark of defiance in his eyes. He fought against the heavy grip of the federal agents, twisting his shoulders just enough to face me directly. "You think you won? Natalie." Richard spat, his voice echoing harshly against the marble walls. "You think you completely destroyed me, but you just destroyed yourself." I stopped a few feet away from him, calmly folding my hands together in front of me. "Go ahead, Richard. Explain it to me." He let out a rough, breathless laugh, revealing teeth stained slightly red from his earlier glass of wine. "The Series B funding is gone. The venture capitalists are running for the hills. The offshore accounts are permanently frozen by the federal government. And the domestic operational accounts are completely empty because I drained them last month. The company is officially dead. It is a massive smoking crater. You went through all of this trouble, you wore the expensive dress, you set the elaborate digital trap. And for what? You get absolutely nothing. You are walking away from this marriage with $0 and 0 cents. I might be going to prison, but you are going entirely bankrupt." He smiled, a twisted, ugly expression of Pyrrhic victory. He honestly believed that if he was going to burn to the ground, he was dragging me directly into the ashes with him. I did not react to his screaming. I reached into my small silver designer clutch and pulled out a single folded sheet of thick paper. I took my time unfolding it, letting the sharp creases snap loudly in the quiet hallway. I held the document up so the bright overhead halogen lights illuminated the bold ink at the very bottom of the page. It was his own arrogant looping signature. "Do you remember this contract, Richard?" I asked quietly. "You signed it in my hotel room exactly 48 hours ago. You were so desperate for a pretty prop to stand next to you tonight that you did not even bother to read the secondary clauses. You just signed away 15% of your founder equity to secure my attendance." Richard stared at the paper. His twisted smile faltered for a second, but he shook his head stubbornly. "It is 15% of nothing, Natalie. The stock is completely worthless. The company is dead." "The company as a functioning startup is dead," I corrected him smoothly. "But the corporate entity still holds massive physical and intellectual assets. You have a 10-year commercial lease on a fully furnished downtown headquarters. You have 36 state-of-the-art server racks. But most importantly, you still own the legal patents for the core algorithmic architecture. The exact same clean technology that Horizon Dynamics was willing to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars just to steal a copy of." Richard blinked, the first cold wave of true comprehension washing over his face. I took a step closer to him, lowering my voice so he could hear the absolute finality of his ruin. "According to the corporate bylaws you drafted yourself, any board member indicted for federal financial crimes is immediately stripped of their voting rights and fiduciary control. You are currently in handcuffs for felony wire fraud. Your brother Greg is resigning to protect himself from the fallout of his wife committing corporate espionage. Naomi is facing her own federal indictment for intellectual property theft." I paused, letting the devastating silence hang in the air for a fraction of a second. "That leaves exactly one person on the equity table with a clean legal record," I whispered. "Me. As the sole remaining shareholder in good standing, I am now the controlling legal entity of your entire tech startup. I am the acting board of directors. I am the primary secured creditor. I have the absolute legal authority to liquidate every single asset your company owns." Richard gasped, his eyes wide with sheer terror. "You cannot do that," he begged, struggling uselessly against the agents. "That is my technology. I built that code. It took me 5 years. And it took me 5 minutes to take it away from you," I replied coldly. "I am going to sell your proprietary source code directly to Vincent Cross. I am going to sell it legally, completely above board, for millions of dollars. And because I am the controlling entity, the proceeds of that liquidation will go directly into my personal trust. I am not walking away bankrupt, Richard. I am walking away with your entire life's work." The heavy steel doors of the service elevator finally slid open behind the federal agents. They grabbed Richard by the arms and began dragging him backward into the sterile metal car. He did not scream anymore. He did not fight. He just stared at me, his face completely hollow, his mind finally breaking under the weight of total, irreversible defeat. The elevator doors slid shut with a heavy final thud, locking him away forever. 2 weeks later, the crisp autumn wind swept through the manicured lawns of the upscale suburban neighborhood. But the atmosphere outside Patricia's sprawling colonial mansion was anything but peaceful. A fleet of massive, heavy-duty moving trucks idled in the long, circular driveway. Burly men in work boots were marching in and out of the grand double doors, carrying away the antique mahogany dining table, the imported silk rugs, and the crystal chandeliers. Richard's arrest had triggered an immediate and catastrophic financial avalanche. Once the federal authorities seized his offshore accounts, the domestic banks aggressively called in all of his fraudulent bridge loans. Because Patricia had blindly co-signed several of his corporate credit lines to maintain her own lavish lifestyle, the banks seized her estate as collateral. She was officially bankrupt, her pristine credit score completely obliterated in a matter of days. Naomi was in an equally disastrous position. True to his word, Greg had locked her out of their home, frozen all their joint accounts, and filed a ruthlessly aggressive divorce petition citing her active federal investigation for corporate espionage as grounds for total asset forfeiture. Now Patricia and Naomi stood shivering on the cracked pavement at the edge of the driveway. They were no longer wearing designer silk or glittering diamonds. They wore cheap sweatpants and oversized jackets, clutching a few black plastic garbage bags filled with whatever clothes the bank liquidators had allowed them to keep. They looked absolutely hollowed out watching the physical manifestation of their arrogance being loaded into the moving trucks. I pulled into the driveway in a sleek chauffeured black SUV. I stepped out onto the pavement, wearing a sharp white cashmere trench coat, holding a slim leather portfolio. As the legally recognized controlling entity of Richard's liquidated corporate assets, I was required to be on site to officially sign off on the property seizures. Patricia saw me, and her face twisted into a mask of pure helpless rage. But before she could even open her mouth to scream, a second vehicle pulled up behind mine. It was a pristine silver luxury sedan. Vincent Cross, the billionaire CEO of Horizon Dynamics, stepped out of the back seat. He walked straight toward me, completely ignoring the two ruined women standing on the curb. He looked at the moving trucks, then offered me a highly respectful smile. "Natalie," Vincent said, extending his hand. "I have to admit, when your legal team reached out to me last week, I was skeptical. But your technical audit of the source code was absolutely flawless." I shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Vincent. Business is business, and I prefer to keep my ledgers perfectly clean." I opened my leather portfolio and handed him a heavy encrypted titanium flash drive containing the entirety of Richard's proprietary algorithmic architecture and all the associated clean tech patents. Vincent pulled a secure digital tablet from his inside jacket pocket, authenticated the transfer protocol, and tapped the screen to execute the final financial agreement. A soft, pleasant chime echoed from my own phone. I looked down at the notification. A confirmed untraceable wire transfer of exactly $20 million had just successfully cleared into my private, highly secured trust account. A pleasure doing business with you, Vincent said, pocketing the drive. He turned, got back into his silver sedan, and drove away, taking Richard's entire work with him. I closed my portfolio and turned to walk back to my SUV. Wait, Patricia croaked, her voice trembling violently as she stumbled forward. Naomi followed closely behind her, her eyes darting desperately between me and the retreating silver car. You just sold his company, Patricia cried, pointing a shaking finger at my portfolio. You just made millions of dollars off my son's hard work. That is family money, Natalie. You owe us. I am losing my house. I have nowhere to go. Naomi clasped her hands together, tears streaming down her face. Natalie, please, she begged, all of her previous arrogance entirely evaporated. Greg took everything. I cannot even afford a retainer for a defense attorney. Just give me a loan, $50,000, just like I asked you for before. Please, I am family. I stopped with my hand resting on the polished door handle of my SUV. I looked at the two women who had spent years mocking my career, insulting my clothes, and actively participating in my planned destruction. You are not my family, I said, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy. You are just a bad investment that I finally wrote off. I reached into the pocket of my cashmere coat. I pulled out a small green plastic card and casually tossed it onto the pavement right at Patricia's feet. It landed with a soft, dismissive click. There is a $10 gift card to the coffee shop down the street, I told them, offering a cold, final smile. You two should go grab a couple of cheap lattes and start looking through the local classified ads. I hear the state-run nursing facilities are currently hiring entry-level janitors. I climbed into the back seat of the SUV and closed the heavy door, signaling my driver to pull away. I did not look back as we drove out of the suburban neighborhood, leaving Patricia and Naomi standing completely alone in the cold shadow of their foreclosed empire. 6 months later, the freezing winds of winter had finally given way to a warm, vibrant spring. I was standing on the terrace of an exclusive invite-only rooftop bar in the heart of Manhattan. The sprawling skyline of New York City stretched out in front of me, a glittering ocean of glass and steel. It was a completely different world from the suffocating suburban prison Richard had tried to build for me. I took a slow sip of my vintage champagne, letting the cool, crisp liquid ground me in the present moment. Down below, millions of people were rushing through the crowded city streets, completely unaware of the absolute corporate massacre I had orchestrated on the other side of the country. My mother was safe. That was the very first thing I secured when the $20 million wire transfer from Horizon Dynamics officially cleared into my private trust. She was no longer subjected to the cruel, arbitrary whims of my former husband. She was currently resting in a sprawling, sunlit luxury recovery suite overlooking Central Park, surrounded by a dedicated team of elite private nurses and the best neurologists money could buy. She was making an incredible recovery, completely shielded from the toxic fallout of the family I had permanently severed ties with. The heavy glass door leading out to the terrace slid open, and David stepped out into the evening air. He was wearing a sharply tailored navy suit, looking completely at home in the high-end environment. He was no longer just a coworker or a senior data analyst. When I formally established my own independent cybersecurity and financial auditing firm with the capital I extracted from Richard's liquidated assets, I made David my chief technology officer and an equal equity partner. We had just closed our third massive enterprise contract of the quarter. David walked over and stood next to me at the glass railing, holding his own glass of expensive bourbon. I just got an alert from my legal contacts back on the West Coast, David said, a deeply satisfied smile spreading across his face. The federal judge handed down the official sentencing this morning. Richard took a blind plea deal to avoid a public trial. 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. He is officially a number in the system. I nodded slowly, looking out at the city lights, and the rest of them. David took a sip of his drink. Greg finalized his divorce from Naomi last week. He successfully proved she was actively engaged in corporate espionage, so the judge granted him total asset forfeiture. She walked away with absolutely nothing. And Patricia is currently renting a small one-bedroom apartment above a noisy laundromat in the outer suburbs. She applied for a receptionist job at a local car dealership, but they turned her down because she demanded a corner office during the interview. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. They had spent years building their entire identities around a false sense of superiority, weaponizing their money and status to make me feel small. Now they were completely bankrupt in every possible sense of the word, entirely erased from the corporate and social circles they had sacrificed everything to conquer. David reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a small, familiar object. The federal authorities officially closed the evidence locker on the wire fraud case yesterday. Since you were technically the legal owner of the corporate hardware, they returned this to you. He held out his hand. Sitting right in the center of his palm was the rose gold smartwatch, the military-grade cloning bug. The very same device Richard had proudly given me on my 33rd birthday, fully intending to use it as the instrument of my absolute destruction. I picked up the watch. The rose gold casing was slightly scratched, but the dark glass screen was still intact. I held it between my fingers, feeling the cold weight of it. It represented every lie, every betrayal, and every cruel manipulation I had endured. I looked down at the crystal flute of expensive champagne in my other hand. Then, with a calm, deliberate motion, I dropped the smartwatch directly into the glass. The heavy device sank instantly to the bottom. The golden bubbles violently rushed around the casing. A few seconds later, a tiny faint spark flashed behind the dark glass screen. A thin wisp of gray smoke bubbled up through the champagne, and the military-grade hardware short-circuited, completely dying a permanent, quiet death at the bottom of my drink. David laughed, clinking his glass against mine. "To new beginnings," he said. "To the Empire," I replied, taking a slow, victorious breath of the cool city air. "Some gifts are meant to keep you chained, but if you know how to reverse engineer the lock, it becomes the key to your empire." Have you ever turned a toxic gift into your greatest weapon? Let me know your story in the comments below. If my journey showed you that you never have to accept the victim role someone else writes for you, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of absolute resilience. Share this with anyone who needs a reminder that the greatest revenge is always massive, undeniable success. Thank you for listening, and remember, you are the architect of your own power. The gripping saga of Natalie and Richard serves as a masterclass in the power of strategic composure. When faced with profound betrayal, a spouse actively plotting her financial and legal ruin, Natalie did not succumb to an expected emotional breakdown. Instead, she leaned heavily into her own expertise. The core lesson here is that malice thrives on impulsive reactions, but it completely shatters against calculated patience. It is incredibly difficult to remain calm when the people who are supposed to protect you try to tear you down. However, Richard's entire scheme hinged on Natalie acting out of fear, panic, or blind rage. By maintaining a stoic facade and quietly reverse-engineering his trap, she transformed her status from a helpless victim into the architect of her own justice. It reminds us that when someone hands you a toxic Trojan horse, you do not have to panic and burn it down immediately. You can study it, dismantle it, and use its very components to build your own fortress. Furthermore, this narrative highlights the undeniable real-world value of deep competence. Natalie did not rely on luck or dramatic shouting matches. She relied on her mastery of cybersecurity, financial law, and data auditing. Knowledge truly is power, especially when it is wielded with a cool head. Her victory was rooted in cold, hard facts and impeccable preparation. While we might not face multi-million-dollar corporate espionage in our daily lives, we all encounter moments where others attempt to undermine, manipulate, or belittle us. In those pivotal moments, our absolute best defense is our own skill set, clear personal boundaries, and the steadfast refusal to play by a toxic person's rules. Take a moment today to identify one professional skill or personal boundary you can strengthen, ensuring that no one can ever weaponize your vulnerabilities against you.